The bells come first, not the kind that call to prayer, the kind that toll for the living, hollow, patient, echoing down London's narrowest streets. Then comes the smell, coal smoke, wet linen, and the faint sweetness of rot. Somewhere behind a workhouse gate, someone coughs into silence. Somewhere else, a door is bolted from the outside. It is the late Victorian age, a city proud of its progress, yet terrified of its reflection. Beneath the gaslight and grandeur, another world exists, quiet, hidden, contagious. Leprosy had returned to London, a medieval ghost reborn in an industrial age. Its victims were not buried, they were erased, sent to asylums that smelled of lime and rain. Doctors spoke of quarantine. The newspapers whispered of divine punishment. So tonight, walk with me through the fog past the river, the ward, the whispers of those who vanished without farewell. Because this is where it began, the forgotten plague, when London's fear of touch built invisible walls around its own heart. Subscribe and stay with me. There are more ghosts to uncover, more histories to haunt, and more nights that never end. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The past still breathes beneath the city's skin. The bells came at dawn, slow and deliberate. Their sound rolled through the fog like breath through lungs gone weak. The city hadn't yet woken. Only the milkmen and the poor heard them, the ones who knew what those bells meant. They weren't for weddings or worship. They were for the living dead. I was walking through Whitechapel then, notebook clutched tight beneath my coat. The air smelled of damp wool and coal smoke, and the sky above the rooftops was the color of pewter. When the first bell tolled, a black cart turned the corner, drawn by a horse too thin to make steam in the cold. Behind it walked two men from the parish workhouse, wrapped in rough scarves, their faces pale as plaster. On the cart lay a shape, beneath a sheet, but it wasn't a corpse, not yet. It moved, barely. No one came near. Doors that had been half open for the morning's deliveries shut softly, one by one, until the street was empty but for them. Even the dog that had followed me from the main road stopped and whimpered, tail low, as if the air itself had turned against it. They were taking the afflicted away, that was the word they used then. Afflicted, not infected, not dying, simply set apart. The city had learned to change its language when the truth became too heavy to speak. A small crowd had gathered at the corner, mostly children with soot on their faces, watching the cart as if it carried treasure. One girl, no older than 10, reached out when the sheet slipped back a little. I caught her wrist before she could touch. "Don't," I whispered, though I didn't know if she understood why. Her eyes met mine, dark, wide, and curious, and for a moment she looked at me like I was the cruel one. Maybe I was. Maybe all of us were. The bells kept ringing, steady as a heartbeat. Somewhere above us, laundry hung between windows like pale flags of surrender. Every toll echoed against the bricks and vanished into the mist. I remember thinking how strange it was that a sound meant to warn could also sound like mourning. At the hospital in Bethnal Green, they would be stripped, washed in carbolic, and recorded under false names. The doctors would write suspected leprosy in the margins, never certain, never official. It wasn't a disease the Empire wanted to admit had come home again. That belonged to the colonies, to the foreign, to the distant. But London was always a harbour, and harbours collect everything the world casts off. As the cart rolled on, the sound of the wheels changed wood against cobble, cobble against mud, until it faded entirely. The fog closed around the space it left behind. A window opened somewhere overhead, and someone crossed themselves. The girl I'd stopped was gone when I looked again. Only her footprints remained, small and fading, leading into an alley that smelled of soap and smoke. The bells rang one last time, softer now, as if exhausted by their own duty, and in that brief hush before the next toll, the city held its breath. Somewhere, a man coughed behind a closed door. Somewhere else, a mother whispered a prayer for skin that would not feel. That was London in the winter of fear, a city that still believed it was untouchable, yet already infected by silence. The first time I saw the ward, it was raining, the kind of cold drizzle that blurs everything into a shade of grey. The carriage stopped at the edge of the grounds, where the gravel turned to mud. I stepped out, boots sinking, and for a moment, the smell of wet earth and disinfectant almost made me turn back. But then the wind shifted, carrying the faintest sound of breathing many breaths, quiet and uneven from somewhere beyond the iron gates. The hospital stood apart from the others, though it pretended to belong. Its name, carved into soot-darkened stone, had once included the word incurable. Someone had chiseled that away, leaving behind a scar the rain hadn't washed smooth. The front doors were locked from the outside. Behind them, an attendant waited with a lantern, his eyes fixed on the ground as he unbolted the chain. Inside, everything smelled of carbolic and silence. The corridors were long and narrow, lined with doors that had no handles, only small openings, cut into the center, as if for confession. The walls were painted the color of weak tea, and the air was heavy with damp linen. Somewhere deep within the building, a bell rang 3 times, followed by the slow shuffle of feet. "This way," the attendant said, voice flat. "Keep your hands to yourself." The ward itself had no windows. They said it was for privacy, but everyone knew why no one wanted the sight of them spilling into daylight. The only light came from gas lamps hung high, burning through a haze of dust and chemical fumes. The beds were arranged in 2 rows, each with a curtain drawn half across. I could hear whispering, and the soft rasp of someone scratching at their skin. One man lay propped on a pillow, his hands wrapped in bandages gone yellow at the edges. When he spoke, his voice was clear, polite even. "Journalist, are you?" I nodded. He smiled, or tried to, but the muscles in his cheeks no longer obeyed. "Then write this down. We're not lepers. We're ghosts who haven't learned the trick of disappearing." I didn't answer. My pen trembled slightly in the cold. In the next bed, a woman hummed to herself, her fingers moving through invisible threads. I realized she was sewing without cloth, the memory of her work still trapped in her hands. Another man, younger, turned his face to the wall when I passed half of it smooth. The other pitted and pale like melted wax. He whispered a prayer that ended in a cough. I tried to speak with the matron before I left. Her uniform was spotless, her gloves immaculate. She stood at the door like a sentinel of propriety, her tone distant, rehearsed. "They are comfortable, they are fed, they are contained." The last word hung in the air like smoke. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the fog had thickened. From the courtyard, I could see faint silhouettes behind the high windows of the upper floor, figures moving slowly. One hand pressed to the glass, though they could, to see nothing beyond. When I asked if they ever opened the shutters, the matron shook her head. "The light disturbs them," she said, but as I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder if it was the other way around, if it was London itself that feared being seen by the forgotten. The gates closed behind me with a sound like a lock turning inside the chest. I thought of the man's words echoing through the hall. "We're not lepers, we're ghosts." And for the first time, I believed him. He arrived on a morning that looked half dead. The fog was so thick it seemed to hang from the lampposts like unwashed curtains, and the sound of hooves outside the hospital gate came soft and ghost-like. Dr. Jonathan Hales was young, younger than most who wore the title his coat, still smelling faintly of new wool and ambition. He had been transferred from Guy's Hospital after volunteering for what the others quietly called the leper ward. He had imagined pity would guide him. Instead, it was curiosity. Inside, the hallways greeted him with the same hush as a chapel. Each footstep sounded too loud, like a trespass. A nurse led him through, her keys jangling softly against her apron as if to remind him that mercy required locks. When the door to the isolation ward opened, the air that escaped was warm and heavy, almost sweet, not the sharp scent of infection, but something quieter, human skin gone still. He found the first patient sitting upright, her back rigid, eyes fixed on the wall. She was a young woman once, though time and illness had done what the years had not. The skin on her hands looked powdered with flour. Her fingers bent inward like roots. "Good morning," Hales said, forcing his voice steady. She didn't reply, but a faint smile crossed her lips, as if to say she'd heard the line too many times before. He reached for her wrist to take her pulse. For a moment he hesitated. The stories flickered through his mind. The contagion that passed by touch, the missionaries buried in lime, the tales whispered in the halls about numb flesh that felt no pain. He touched her anyway. Her skin was cool, almost waxen. The pulse beat softly beneath it, not sick, not dying, simply absent. "She feels nothing," said the nurse, who stood in the doorway. "Most of them don't." He looked up. "Nothing at all?" The nurse shrugged. "The body forgets the pain before it forgets itself." That evening, Hales sat in the pain physician's office, a small room lined with cabinets and sealed jars. Inside them floated things that used to be parts of people. The senior doctor, an old man with trembling hands, leaned close over his pipe smoke. "It's not the disease that ruins them," he said. "It's the fear. No one wants to be seen with them, so they vanish. That's the real contagion, the vanishing," Hales wrote in his journal that night. Though the words came slow, he described the first patient, the color of her skin, the absence of sensation, the silence in her eyes. Then he wrote a sentence that surprised even him. "She looked peaceful." He crossed it out quickly, ashamed of what it implied. When he returned to the ward the next day, he found the bed empty. The nurse told him she had been moved to the upper floor for the quieter cases. He looked toward the staircase, half expecting to see her shadow waiting at the landing. There was nothing, only the sound of the lamp hissing in, the fog outside. Later, as he left the hospital, he rubbed his thumb against his own skin, just to feel it warm and alive. But for the first time, the warmth felt foreign, like something borrowed. The rain had begun again, and through it came the distant toll of bells, steady and low. He didn't yet know what they meant, but soon he would. She arrived at Tilbury Docks on a fog-drowned afternoon in late autumn, 1879, a passenger from the P&O liner Indus, whose name was not written on the manifest. The port inspectors said she'd come from Bombay by way of Suez, travelling alone with a single leather trunk and a letter sealed in wax. To the dock workers, she looked no different from any other colonial widow, pale from the sea, tired from the long voyage, shrouded in a travelling cloak that smelled faintly of salt and jasmine. But when she reached to hand over her papers, one of the men noticed the gloves. They were fine silk, a little too fine for her station. She wore them even when the rain began to fall, even when the ink on her passport bled through. When asked to remove them, she hesitated only for a heartbeat, and that hesitation was enough to summon the surgeon of the port. Dr. Hales was on duty that day, sent by the Board of Health to inspect suspect arrivals from the east. He remembered her clearly in his later notes, a lady of quiet manner, complexion sallow, eyes dark and alert, right hand gloved in silk, left hand gloved and trembling. She spoke English softly, with the rhythm of someone educated in convent halls. "It is an old burn," she said, "from the kitchens, long ago." But when she tried to lift her trunk, the glove slipped. The skin beneath was pale, mottled, the fingers fused at the joints as though sculpted from wax. Hales took her hand gently, trying not to flinch. It was cool to the touch, almost bloodless. She did not seem to feel his grasp at all. He wrote later that she smiled when she saw his expression. "Do not fear, doctor," she whispered. "It does not hurt." The port authorities isolated her immediately, sending her by covered carriage to the quarantine hospital at Rotherhithe. The journey took place at night, to avoid the eyes of the curious. Inside the carriage, she stared out through the small glass pane at the city lights, blinking against the blur of fog. "In Bombay," she murmured, "they called it Kusht Rog. My mother said it was God's way of teaching patience." In the ward, the nurses avoided her gaze. Some thought she carried a curse. Others whispered that she was a merchant's widow, disowned for shame. But in truth, She was simply a woman displaced by empire, born of two worlds and welcomed by neither. Hales visited her daily. He took samples, recorded notes, and asked questions about her past. She spoke of the monsoon rains, the scent of neem leaves, the way the city glowed like embers at dusk. But when he asked when the disease began, her voice fell to a whisper. "It began," she said, "when I could no longer feel the rain." Weeks passed. Her gloves remained beside her bed, folded neatly as if waiting to be worn again. She died quietly one evening while the nurses changed the linens, her pulse fading like a clock running down. In her trunk they found letters, written in 2 languages, and a small vial of rosewater wrapped in silk. The newspapers never mentioned her name. They called her the Bombay Woman, the first confirmed case of Oriental leprosy in modern London. The city shuddered at the thought that such a thing had come by ship and not by sin. That winter, Dr. Hales began to wear gloves of his own, not silk, but leather, the kind used by surgeons when the work demanded distance. He told himself it was caution, but sometimes, alone at his desk, he would rub his thumb across the seam and remember her words, "It does not hurt." And somewhere, far downriver, the fog carried the sound of a bell rolling through the docks, a low, morning note that made the sailors cross themselves. In the vestry of St. Luke's parish, the ledgers were kept in a locked cupboard, thick leather volumes that smelled of dust and candle soot. Each page was lined with neat black ink, a census of every soul the parish claimed to know. Births, baptisms, marriages, deaths. But in one of the later volumes, a new column had been added in a trembling hand. Removed. It began as a small notation beside a few names in the early 1870s. Then, as the decade darkened, the word appeared more often. Removed to hospital. Removed for contagion. Sometimes simply removed, with no explanation at all. The vicar wrote them himself, Reverend Josiah Finch, a man known in the parish for his mild voice and his iron faith. Every Sunday, he preached about compassion, though compassion had grown difficult to practice in those years. The first removed had been a woman named Clara Briggs, a laundress who lived on Flower and Dean Street. The congregation remembered her for her voice, which carried through the hymns like light through stained glass. One winter morning, she stopped coming. The vicar went to her house, found the shutters closed and the landlord silent. The neighbors said she had been taken away after her hands began to peel, the skin raw as parchment. Finch had written "removed" beside her name and moved on to the next line. He told himself it was mercy. Recording meant remembering, and remembering meant prayer. Yet, as the months went on, he began to realize he was keeping a secret archive of the city's exile, a list of those erased not by death, but by shame. Sometimes, late at night, he would open the cupboard and read their names aloud to himself. The candlelight trembled over the ink. Thomas Gray, butcher's apprentice; Mary Turner, widow; Samuel Field, soldier returned from the Indies. Each name carried its own silence. In spring, Dr. Hales came to the rectory. He was pale, thinner than before, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness. He asked for the parish records, saying the Board of Health required confirmation of addresses for the suspected cases. Finch hesitated. "These are not criminals, Doctor," he said softly. "They are parishioners." Hales sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And yet London has made them both." Together they turned the pages. The priest's candle sputtered in the draught. Outside, the rain pressed against the stained glass, blurring the saints into smears of color. When they reached the name of a child, Ellen Brooks, age 7, the doctor's hand stopped. "I saw her," he murmured. She sang to her mother through the window bars. He did not speak again for several minutes. That night, Finch made his sermon on Matthew 8, the healing of the leper. But as he stood before his congregation, he could not finish the passage. His voice faltered at the words, "Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean." For the first time he wondered whether it was deed, cleanliness, or comfort that his city truly worshipped. When the bell rang for evening prayer, it sounded wrong, hollow, distant, as if muffled by fog. After the service, Finch dipped his quill again and turned to the newest page of the register. The candle burned low. He hesitated only a moment before writing the next name, Reverend Josiah Finch removed. He did not know yet why he wrote it. Perhaps because the city itself felt sick, its conscience numb, or perhaps because, in that moment, he finally understood what it meant to be unclean, not in the body, but in the soul. The house stood at the end of a narrow street near Mile End Road, small enough to be forgotten, old enough to look ashamed. Its windows had been painted shut years ago, the glass cloudy with mildew and dust. On the gatepost, a brass number 43 glimmered faintly under the gaslight. No one ever saw anyone enter or leave, though neighbors sometimes heard faint singing in the evening, a child's voice rising and falling like breath through frost. Inside lived the Harrows, a mother and her son. Her name was Lydia. His was Samuel. They had moved there after her husband's death from typhus, a quiet widow, and her bright-eyed boy, who rarely played outdoors. The neighbors thought her shy, perhaps proud. She bought coal at dawn and bread at dusk, speaking only to the grocer's wife, who noticed the gloves she always wore, even in summer. It began, they said, with a rash, just a few pale spots on the back of her hand, the kind that come and go with the washing. But the color spread, and the feeling went with it. When she pricked her finger while sewing, she didn't bleed. By autumn, she could no longer button her own coat, so she stopped leaving the house altogether. The boy grew thin that winter. He fetched water, swept the hearth, cooked what little they could afford. Sometimes he stood at the window, tracing shapes in the condensation with his fingertip. The world outside moved without him, carts rattling down the street, the smell of roasted chestnuts, laughter muffled by walls. He didn't know that his home had become a rumor. People whispered. Some said the woman was mad. Others said she had caught the Eastern sickness, the one that ate the flesh but left the body alive. The landlord sent letters, but she never opened the door. When the parish officer came knocking, she told Samuel to stay silent. They sat together in the dark until the footsteps went away. By the time Dr. Hales found them, spring had come. The neighbors had complained of a smell. He arrived with a constable and a nurse, carrying a lantern and a letter of order. The door creaked open at his touch, and the air that came out was stale with dust and candle wax. He found her sitting in a chair by the window, thin as a shadow, her face hidden behind a scarf. Samuel stood beside her, his small hand resting on her sleeve. "We're not sick," the boy said. "We just don't go out." Hales knelt beside her. The scarf slipped, revealing the pale mask beneath skin, smoothed of expression. Lips cracked but smiling faintly. "Please," she whispered, "let me stay." He wanted to. God help him, he wanted to. But he had seen too many like her, hidden behind curtains, waiting for permission to vanish. He called for the stretcher. The boy began to cry. When they carried her out, the street fell silent. Curtains twitched, doors closed. No one spoke her name again. The house was fumigated, the walls scrubbed with lime. Yet weeks later, the singing returned, faint, high, and sweet, as though the boy still stood at the window, tracing circles in the fog. Dr. Hales walked past the house one night, months later. A single light burned in the upstairs room, steady and small. He told himself it was the caretaker's lamp, but deep down, he knew better. Some houses never truly empty, they just keep breathing quietly, waiting for the next life to move in. The chamber smelled of rain-soaked wool and ink. Rows of dark coats hung from pegs along the panelled wall, dripping steadily onto the stone floor. The Board of Health met once each month, but in those years the meetings had become more frequent, more anxious. London was growing fast, too fast for its lungs. Cholera had receded. Smallpox was tamed by vaccination. Yet now there was talk of something older, stranger, less containable. At the head of the long oak table sat Sir Alistair Pember, Secretary for Public Sanitation, a man whose expression resembled the iron latch of a cellar door. He cleared his throat as the last members took their seats. "Gentlemen," he began, "there are rumors circulating through the East End concerning a disease long thought foreign to these shores. I have here reports from the quarantine station, from the parish infirmaries, and from Dr. Hales at Rotherhithe. The word used is," he paused, lowering his voice, "leprosy." The word itself caused a shiver to move through the room, like a draught under the floorboards. One of the older members coughed into his handkerchief. Another reached for his pen, though he wrote nothing. "We must proceed with caution," Pember continued. "The newspapers must not have this. Panic would undo the order we fought to build. The empire depends on the appearance of health." A clerk read from a sheet, his voice uncertain. "Cases have been reported among seamen arriving from Bombay, Singapore, and Mauritius. There are unconfirmed instances in Mile End, Whitechapel, and Poplar. The afflicted are isolated, though not formally registered." "Registered?" repeated Pember. "For God's sake, man, what are we to record them as? Citizens? Outcasts? The public would sooner see them transported than treated." The room fell into a silence thick as fog. Only the ticking of a wall clock broke it. Dr. Hales, who sat among them for the first time, leaned forward. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "I've seen these people. They are not contagion made flesh. They are poor, frightened, and abandoned. What they need is care, not exile." A murmur passed through the assembly, half disapproval, half discomfort. Pember's gaze fixed on him. "Doctor, your compassion does you credit, but compassion is not policy. We govern a city, not a congregation." Later, as the meeting adjourned, the members drifted out beneath their umbrellas, disappearing one by one into the mist of Westminster. Hales remained behind, staring at the pile of reports stacked before him. Each page carried the same plea, hidden between the statistics. "Someone saw me once." He walked home along the Thames embankment, where the lamps shone like weak stars in the fog. Barges moved silently through the water, their lanterns swaying. He thought of the patients locked away in windowless wards, of Lydia Harrow's boy standing at the pane, of the woman from Bombay, whose gloves still lay folded on her bed. By the time he reached his rooms in Bloomsbury, the rain had turned to sleet. He lit the fire, unbuttoned his coat, and took out his notebook. On the first page he wrote, "If the empire fears disease more than cruelty, then we are the infection." He paused, stared at the line, then closed the book before the ink had dried. At that same hour, in the offices of the board, Pember signed an order for voluntary relocation of the afflicted to asylums outside the city. The word voluntary was underlined twice. The candle beside him flickered, bending the shadows of his signature across the page. London slept, unaware that by morning a new kind of map would begin to form, one drawn not by rivers or streets, but by fear. It floated in the grey mouth of the Thames like something the city wanted to forget. The Endeavour had once been a merchant vessel, its hull built for spice and silk, but now its cargo was silence. Stripped of her sails and anchored off Rotherhithe, she had been refitted by order of the Board of Health to hold 20 patients for observation. The newspapers called it precaution. The locals called it damnation on water. From the shore, the ship looked ghostly. Her masts stood bare against the fog, ropes creaking like old bones. Lanterns burned through the night on her deck, faint, sickly lights that trembled in the mist. No one came near except the supply boat twice a week, bringing food, medicine, and the few brave nurses who rotated through the duty. When the tide was low, the smell reached the docks. Salt, damp wood, and carbolic acid sharp enough to sting the eyes. Dr. Hales made his first visit in early December. The small launch that carried him out to the ship moved, slowly, its oars dipping into the black water with the rhythm of a heartbeat. The river was strangely still, save for the occasional ripple of something unseen beneath the surface. Behind him, London was just a smear of lamps, a city fading into its own distance. A sailor in oilskin helped him aboard. "Careful, sir," the man muttered. She's not fond of visitors. Hales thought he meant the ship, but later he wondered if the man had meant the souls inside it. The patients were housed in the old cargo hold, converted into a ward with narrow bunks and iron railings. There was no sound when he entered, only the slow drip of condensation from the beams above. The air was heavy, still, faintly metallic. He saw faces turned toward him, pale, alert, but quiet. Some wore bandages, others nothing at all. They looked like men caught between two worlds, unsure which one would claim them. One woman asked if they were to be moved soon. Her voice was calm, polite. Hales checked his notes. "In time," he said. She smiled sadly. "That means never." He examined them one by one, the swollen joints, the pale patches, the eyes that no longer blinked fully. He noted the numbness in fingers, the loss of pain. Yet what unsettled him most was not the disease but their composure. These were not the fevered, coughing bodies of cholera or typhus. These were quiet sufferers, people who simply faded. That night, a storm rose. From his small cabin, Hales heard the ship groan as if it were alive. Rain lashed the deck, and the lanterns swung wildly, scattering their light like fragments of thought. He went above to check the ward, and in that half-light, he saw them, the patients standing by their bunks, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if listening to something above. "What is it?" he asked the nurse beside him. "They say it's the city calling," she whispered. "They can hear the bells." By morning, the river had swallowed the fog again. A gull perched on the rail, crying over the water. Hales watched the grey horizon where London disappeared and thought of the thousands who lived just beyond the reach of sight, untouched, unseeing, safe. He realized then what the Endeavour truly was. Not a hospital, but a mirror. It floated there still, halfway between mercy and abandonment, a reminder that the Empire preferred its sicknesses offshore, where the tide could wash them away unseen. He arrived unannounced, as all men with government permission do. The year was 1874, and London had begun to trade in images as much as in goods. Photography had become a new kind of witness, mechanical, impartial, and incapable of pity. The Board of Health, in its hunger for record and reassurance, had commissioned a series of scientific portraits to document the progress of what they still called tropical contagions. And so it was that a man named Elias Croft climbed the gangway of the quarantine ship Endeavour with a camera case and the calm arrogance of official purpose. The sky that morning was the colour of pewter, the river beneath it dull as soot. Croft wore a bowler hat and gloves, his coat buttoned tight to the throat. The sailors watched him with the wary eyes of men who had learned not to trust anything that came from the shore. His camera, an enormous brass and wood contraption, was slung over his shoulder like a coffin lid. Dr. Hales met him at the rail. "This is not a spectacle," he said quietly. "These people have already lost their names. Don't take the rest." Croft smiled, a small, dry smile. "Doctor, I assure you, science does not judge, it preserves." They descended into the ward. The patients stirred as the door opened, the sound of boots, the faint chemical odor of the photographic plates. The gas lamps hissed above them, their light catching on the metal edges of the camera. Croft set up his equipment methodically, measuring distance, adjusting the lens. The first subject was a young sailor from Mauritius, his hands bound in linen. Croft positioned him against a painted backdrop that had been brought aboard for the purpose, a pastoral landscape, absurd in its serenity. "Hold still," he instructed. The man did not move. The flash of light filled the hold like lightning, followed by the sharp smell of burning powder. One by one, the patients were brought forward. Some turned away, others stared, straight into the lens as though daring it to see them. Hales watched in silence, his hands tightening behind his back. When it was over, Croft packed his plates carefully, each one a thin, ghostly impression of a life in suspension. Before leaving, he asked to photograph the doctor as well. "For the record," he said. Hales refused. "I'd rather remain invisible with them," he answered. On the shore that evening, Croft developed the images in a rented room near the docks. The first plates came out faint and milky, the faces dissolving into mist. But one print startled him, a woman standing near the bunk rail, her features almost erased, yet her eyes unnervingly clear. Behind her, barely visible, was a reflection Hales himself, caught in the background, his expression unreadable, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The photograph would later hang in the archives of the Royal College of Medicine under the title Leprous Subjects, London, 1874. No one would mention the reflection. Years later, when Hales saw a copy of it reproduced in a medical journal, he thought the eyes in the picture looked alive, too alive. That night he dreamed of the camera's flash again, the white burst, the smell of smoke, the faces caught forever between light and forgetting. In the morning, he woke with the strange certainty that the disease was not what the world feared most. It was the gaze, that cold, steady gaze that turned suffering into spectacle and compassion into evidence. The letter began simply, "My dearest Edward, I hope you are well, and that spring has reached the garden by now." There was nothing strange in the handwriting firm, graceful, as though the hand that wrote it were perfectly steady. Only at the end, where the ink grew faint and the lines became short, did the truth begin to show. The letter was dated from the Chatham Leper Asylum, March of 1875, and it was never posted. The nurses found it weeks later folded neatly beneath her pillow, the paper soft from being touched too often. Her name was Margaret Daw. Once a governess, she had come from a family of miners standing in Kent. The parish register described her illness as a cutaneous disorder of uncertain origin. Those words had been written by her brother-in-law, a solicitor, who took her in after her dismissal from the household where she'd worked. When the first pale marks appeared on her wrists, the family doctor told them not to worry. When her fingertips began to lose feeling, he stopped calling altogether. They brought her to Chatham quietly. At dusk, the cab was unmarked, and the driver was told she had a nervous condition. She carried only a small bag, a Bible, and a locket containing a miniature of a young man in uniform, the same Edward she addressed in her letter. The asylum sat on a hill above the town, its chimneys breathing faint trails of smoke into the dusk. The corridors were narrow and lined with tiles that echoed every footstep. The matron assigned her a room on the upper floor, a small cell-like chamber with a single bed, a window that did not open, and a crucifix nailed slightly crooked to the wall. In the evenings, she wrote, the nurses said she did not speak much, but the scratch of her pen could be heard through the door until long after midnight. Her letters were full of ordinary things, the weather, the sound of the chapel bell, the flowers she imagined were blooming at home. She never mentioned the disease. She spoke instead of missing touch, the feel of the sun on her hands, the press of Edward's coat against her cheek. Dr. Hales visited her twice. The second time, he found her seated by the window, her face turned toward the glass, though the world beyond was hidden by mist. "You should rest, Mrs. Daw," he said gently. She smiled. "When I write," she replied, "I am home." The letter ended with a single line, "Tell them I am well. Tell them I am no longer afraid to be seen." A week later, her pulse failed quietly in the night. The matron recorded the time, 2:37 a.m., and folded the sheets with careful precision. They burned her clothes, washed the walls, and sealed the room for fumigation. The letter was placed with her effects, but her family never came to claim them. Hales read it once before it was archived. The ink had bled in places from the damp, and the words near the end were nearly gone. Still, the final line was clear, the handwriting small but certain. "You will find me in the morning light." For months afterward, the doctor could not pass the hill at Chatham without glancing up at the window of the upper floor. Sometimes he thought he saw movement there, a faint, pale hand brushing the curtain aside, as if waving farewell. But the ward had been empty since spring. Only the echo of her words remained, soft as breath against the glass, carried away by the wind that rolled down from the sea. The smell arrived before the light did, sharp, medicinal, and unrelenting. It filled every corridor, every sheet, every breath. To step inside street. Bartholomew's new isolation wing was to taste the chemical before one could see the room. Carbolic acid, Joseph Lister's miracle, they called it. A thin red liquid that promised salvation through sterility, though it burned everything it touched. London had embraced it like a charm against the unseen, baptizing its wounds in fire to ward off the ghosts of contagion. Dr. Hales walked the ward at dawn, his boots echoing against the freshly scrubbed floor. A nurse followed with a bucket, scattering sawdust soaked in disinfectant wherever he stepped. The patients coughed weakly in their beds, wrapped in linen that reeked of acid and soap. The air itself seemed to hum a low vibration of damp cloth and fear. He paused at the bedside of a young woman whose skin had been rubbed raw from the constant cleaning. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the blanket. "Will it stop the sickness, doctor?" she asked, eyes wide. "It keeps us safe," he said, though he could not say from what. He had been using carbolic for months now, washing his hands in it until the skin cracked, rinsing instruments, bleaching floors. The Board of Health demanded it. The nurses obeyed without question. But lately he had begun to notice how the smell clung to him long after he left the hospital. It seeped into his clothes, his books, even his sleep. Sometimes, at home, he caught it in the folds of his pillowcase and woke with the taste of metal on his tongue. In the laboratory downstairs, glass jars lined the shelves like trophies. Inside them floated tissues and samples preserved in spirit, pale specimens labeled in careful script. Dermal lesion, Rotherhithe, nasal tissue, mile end case, hand fragment, unidentified female. The air was cold, heavy with disinfectant and quiet guilt. Hales had convinced himself that study was a form of mercy, that if he could name the disease, he could unmake its fear. But lately, the jars looked more like confessions than cures. One evening, while cleaning his instruments, he noticed that his hands no longer stung from the acid. The skin had hardened, the nerves gone numb. He watched a bead of the red liquid roll over his palm and felt nothing at all. For a moment he thought of the patients, their pale fingers, their calm faces, the way they seemed untouched by pain. And he wondered whether the carbolic had done more than sterilize the ward. Perhaps it had begun to teach him the same cruel gift, indifference. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, thick as wool. The lamps flickered orange through the haze, and the city seemed to breathe in slow, shallow gulps. Somewhere, a bell tolled the hour, muffled, distant, but unmistakable. A nurse entered carrying fresh linens, her apron damp from the wash. "More patients from the dock, sir," she said softly. "The inspector's orders." Hales nodded, though his throat tightened. "Scrub the cots," he replied. "Carbolic, twice." She obeyed, and soon the scent grew stronger, a tide of red vapor rising through the air until it drowned out the human beneath. When the doctor finally stepped outside, the night wind caught his coat and carried the smell of the ward with it, over the river, through the alleys, across the sleeping city. London smelled clean that night, almost holy, but somewhere beneath the purity, beneath the polished marble and the new gaslight, something darker lingered, the quiet certainty that the city was cleansing itself not of disease, but of those who carried it. The scalpel never trembled in his hand, though the hand itself no longer felt like his own. By the winter of 1876, Dr. Hales had become one of the most requested surgeons in London's eastern wards, not for his speed or brilliance, but for his stillness. They said he could cut as though guided by a clockmaker's heart, precise, cold, unerring. No one knew that the calm was not discipline but exhaustion, a slow fading of conscience disguised as skill. That morning, the frost had climbed the inside of the window panes, etching delicate patterns that looked like veins. Hales stood before them, washing his hands in carbolic once more. His assistant, a young man named Pritchard, read aloud from the patient list: 3 amputations, 1 debridement, and a removal of tissue from a suspected leprosy case brought in from the outskirts of Poplar. "They say she's not contagious, sir," Pritchard added quickly, though his voice shook. "They always say that," Hales murmured. The operating theatre was little more than a raised platform surrounded by benches, where students sat with notebooks and the faint perfume of tobacco clinging to their coats. The lamps burned high and white. The patient was a middle-aged woman, her face shrouded, her hand already pale from the tourniquet. The disease had left her fingers curled inward like dead petals. As he worked, the murmurs from the benches blurred into the hum of flame. He felt the familiar distance take hold, that thin glass wall between thought and feeling that made the work possible. When the knife slipped through tissue, he felt neither triumph nor revulsion, only relief at the precision, only the quiet rhythm of breathing that was not his own. Afterward, when the room had emptied and the instruments lay soaking in their trays, Pritchard lingered. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "you didn't flinch when she thanked you." Hales looked up. "Should I have?" She said, "You'd saved her soul." The doctor turned away, drying his hands. "Souls are not my department." But that night, alone in his quarters above the hospital, he opened his notebook and stared at the pages he could not bring himself to write. For the first time in years, the silence of the ward followed him home, the echo of the woman's voice, calm and certain, saying thank you, as though she had just been forgiven. He dreamt of the operation again, the bloodless hand, the lamp's glare, the soft click of bone against metal. In the dream, the face beneath the shroud was not hers but his own. At dawn, he walked back to the hospital before the streets had woken. The river mist rolled over the cobblestones, and the lamps still burned with their steady hiss. He went to the storeroom and found the jar marked Specimen 34. Peripheral tissue, female. Inside floated the pale section he had removed the day before. It looked almost luminous in the half-light. He held it for a moment, feeling the cold seep through the glass, and whispered to no one, "Forgive me." When he placed it back on the shelf, he noticed his reflection in the row of jars, dozens of faces staring back at him through the distorted glass. None of them looked like the man he remembered being. From that day on, the nurses said the doctor had grown quieter. He no longer corrected their prayers nor scolded their superstition. He began allowing candles to burn beside the beds of the dying, saying softly, "If they must leave in light, let them." And yet, even as he spoke those words, the carbolic sting lingered on his hands, sharp, clean, unforgiving, as though London itself demanded not healing, but penance. It began, as most things do, with something small, a pinprick, a splinter, a cut from a kitchen knife. The patients told the story in different ways, but the ending was always the same. They felt nothing. The wound bled, yes, but the pain never came. At first, they called it a blessing. Pain, after all, was the language of the poor, an old, constant companion. Only later did they understand that pain was also proof of life. The first of these cases arrived in spring. A coal labourer named Henry Cobb. His wife said he had burned his hand tending the furnace and hadn't noticed until the skin began to flake away. By the time Dr. Hales examined him, the burn had healed too perfectly white, smooth, as if the flesh had been replaced with something not quite human. "No sensation?" Hales asked, pressing a needle gently to the man's palm. Cobb watched without blinking. "None, sir. Feels like I'm touching someone else's skin." The doctor noted it carefully in his plate palm. Ledger. Progressive anesthesia. Localized. Then, almost reluctantly, he added a second line. Suspect Hansen's disease. He hated writing it. To name the illness was to summon its curse, to invite the city's fear through the door. But he could no longer pretend it wasn't spreading. Soon came others, a seamstress whose fingertips bled from the needle without her knowing, a clerk who dropped his pen each time his hand went numb, a child from Limehouse whose mother brought him wrapped in a shawl, whispering that he couldn't feel the cold. Each case added a new silence to the ward, the kind that crept in after the coughing stopped. When the body forgot the boundaries of itself, Hales watched them with the fascination of a man standing at the edge of something holy and terrible. He pricked their skin, pressed their nerves, charted their decline. Yet each time, he found the same still calm in their faces, a serenity born not from peace, but from detachment. It frightened him more than fever ever had. Late one evening, he sat by the bedside of a woman from Shoreditch who had lost feeling in both hands. She held them up before her, studying them under the lamp's glow. "It's like they've gone ahead of me," she said softly, "as if they're already dead, and I'm still waiting to follow." He said nothing. Instead, he reached for her wrist, searching for a pulse. It was there, faint, rhythmic, obstinate, life, insisting on itself. After she slept, Hales lingered by the window. Outside, the rain beat against the glass like fingertips. He pressed his own hand to it, feeling the cold seep through the pane. It struck him that one day he might not feel it either. The thought clung to him like damp wool. Back in his study, he recorded the day's findings. His handwriting, once confident, had grown smaller, as though ashamed of what it described. Loss of sensation precedes visible decay, pain absent even in disfigurement. Subject exhibits calm acceptance. He paused, then added, "Perhaps suffering is the last proof of being alive." He closed the book and extinguished the lamp. In the dark, the smell of carbolic clung to his hands, sharp, sterile, endless, and somewhere beyond the hospital walls, London continued its restless hum, a city numb to its own afflictions, unaware that beneath its skin something had already begun to die. The little shop on Dean Street was easy to miss, a narrow front with fading letters above the window that read, "M. Halberd, fine repairs and gloves." Inside, it always smelled faintly of starch and candle wax, and the ticking of a small clock filled the silence between stitches. Most who passed by never noticed the woman working behind the counter. Those who did remembered only her gloves, thin, ivory-colored, buttoned tightly at the wrist no matter the season. Her name was Martha Halberd, though few used it. The tradesmen simply called her the seamstress, and the constable who patrolled the block referred to her with polite pity as that quiet widow in the gloves. She had once been an apprentice dressmaker, skillful enough to mend silk without leaving a trace. But sometime around 1872, she stopped taking commissions that required her to leave the shop. She worked by lamplight late into the night, her shadow trembling against the curtained glass. It began with the fingertips. The thimble slipped, the needle pierced too deep, but there was no sting. She laughed at first, thinking it the result of exhaustion, yet soon the numbness crept higher, past the knuckles, past the wrist. When she pricked her skin, the blood came slow and dark, as if reluctant to leave her. She wrapped the wound and went back to work, sewing gloves for others who needed them, never realizing she was sewing armor for herself. By the time Dr. Hales found her, she had not stepped outside in nearly a year. A neighbor's letter had reached the parish, reporting a peculiar illness in the glovemaker's shop. He went in the afternoon, when the light fell weakly through the soot-streaked window. She looked up from her stool as he entered, small, pale, her lips chapped from the cold. "You'll forgive the smell," she said, motioning to the pot of wax on the stove. "It keeps the fabric stiff." He asked to see her hands. She hesitated, then unbuttoned the gloves with slow, deliberate care. What he saw made him draw in a breath. The skin was white and smooth as candle tallow. The fingers curled slightly inward, the nails dulled to a faint translucence. "Do they hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. "They don't feel much of anything now. It's peaceful, in a way, like the world's gone soft." He wrote her address in his ledger and promised to send for a carriage to the hospital. She only smiled. "I've made enough gloves for everyone else, doctor. Let me finish my own pair before I go." When the carriage came 2 days later, the shop was dark. The lamp had burned down to its base, and the air smelled of melted wax. On the work table lay 2 nearly finished gloves, silk, lined with a soft inner fabric, and beside them a single hand resting palm up, perfectly still, as if waiting to be measured. The coroner called it natural causes, though no one could say what nature had claimed her. Dr. Hales requested that the gloves be sent to the hospital for study, but they were lost before the paperwork was filed. Some said the constable took them for his wife, who admired fine lace. Others claimed they burned with the rest of her belongings. Weeks later, one of her neighbors swore she saw a light in the shop after midnight, a faint golden flicker behind the glass, and the silhouette of a woman at her table, head bowed, sewing steadily, the rhythm never breaking. Perhaps it was only the reflection of a street lamp, or perhaps the seamstress was still at her work, finishing the gloves no living hand would ever wear. It appeared one morning without warning, page 3 of the Illustrated London Herald, beneath an engraving of a factory fire and a report on Parliament's budget. The headline was small but terrible: Leprosy returns to London. The letters were bold, black, unflinching. Beneath them, a subheading read, Foreign disease among the poor. Authorities assure public there is no cause for alarm. By noon, every coffee house and omnibus stop was whispering the same words. Londoners folded the papers quickly, pretending to be indifferent, yet everyone's eyes lingered on that single word, leprosy. It felt ancient, biblical, impossible. The disease belonged to dusty scripture and distant colonies, not to a city of gaslight and empire. And yet, there it was in print, carrying the weight of confession. Dr. Hales saw the headline through a shop window as he walked to the hospital. A stack of papers sat beside the newsboy's feet, the ink still damp from the press. He bought one, and read as he walked, his gloves leaving smudges of soot across the page. The article was written with the cruel precision of a scalpel. New evidence from the East End suggests the presence of a disease long believed extinct in Britain. Several cases have been identified among the destitute population of Mile End and Rotherhithe, though officials emphasize the situation is contained. The contagion, once associated with the Dark Ages, has returned. Each word felt like a stone. Contained, destitute, contagion. The language was measured, yet behind its calm, Hales could hear the panic beginning to stir. By evening, the panic had a pulse. Shopkeepers in Whitechapel scrubbed their doorsteps with vinegar. Streetcar drivers refused to take passengers who coughed. Rumors grew that the disease could spread through coin, through touch, through breath. A baker was driven from his stall after a customer saw a pale mark on his arm. Children were kept home from school. Even the priests of Street Lukes hesitated to offer communion. That night, Hales attended an emergency meeting at the Board of Health. The same men who had once argued for secrecy now demanded visibility, not mercy, but control. "We must calm the public," Sir Alistair Pember declared, his voice firm. "Quarantine must be expanded. We cannot risk sympathy. Sympathy breeds contamination." "Sympathy breeds humanity," Hales said quietly. Pember looked at him over his spectacles. "Then humanity, doctor, must learn restraint." Outside the meeting hall, reporters waited like wolves. Their pencils scratched furiously as officials passed. Hales kept his head down, but one journalist, a young woman with ink-stained fingers, caught his sleeve. "Is it true?" she asked. "Are we in danger?" He hesitated. The truth hovered at the back of his throat, the truth that the disease was not the greatest danger, but the city's fear of it. "We are," he said at last, "but not in the way you think." The next morning's edition ran his words in italics. They filled the final paragraph, stripped of context, and read like prophecy. "We are in danger." By the end of the week, 4 more hospitals had reported suspicious cases. The asylum at Chatham overflowed. Guards were posted at the docks. And everywhere the smell of carbolic grew stronger, as if the whole city were trying to scrub itself clean of guilt. Hales stopped reading the papers after that, but one afternoon, passing a vendor, he caught sight of the same headline reprinted on a poster, weather-stained and torn: "Leprosy returns to London." The ink had run in the rain. The word returns bleeding downward like a wound that refused to heal. He stood for a long time in front of it, the street moving around him, the sky pressing low with soot and fog. Somewhere behind him, church bells rang, not for the sick, not for the dead, but for the city itself, tolling softly for what little compassion remained. In the narrow heart of Spitalfields, where the fog pooled thickest and the cobblestones sweated with cold, stood a small chapel that no longer appeared on official maps. Its bell tower leaned slightly, its cross blackened by soot. There were no parish notices posted at the gate, no lists of births or bans. Only a brass plate beside the door read, faintly under grime, Street Lazarus Mission. It was not a parish in the city's eyes, but it was one in spirit, a refuge for those the rest of London refused to see. The afflicted came at dusk, when the streets grew soft with shadow. They came wrapped in shawls, in scarves, in secrecy. The Sisters of Street. Lazarus, a handful of women in coarse grey habits, opened the door for each one without question. They did not ask for papers or names. They asked only, "Are you hungry?" Inside, the air was warm and heavy with candle smoke. The walls had once been white but were now a shade of brownish gold, the colour of hands rubbed against prayer. There were pews for maybe 20 souls, though twice as many crowded in on the coldest nights. Behind the small altar, a wooden crucifix leaned forward slightly, as if listening. Sister Agnes, the eldest, led the prayers. Her voice trembled but never broke. He touched the leper, and he was made clean. She would read from the Gospel of Luke, her words echoing off the cracked plaster. The congregation, men and women whose faces bore the pallor of both poverty and disease, murmured, "Amen," their voices blending into something soft and weary, like wind through reeds. They called themselves the Forgotten, though the sisters refused the name. "You are not forgotten here," Agnes would say. "Not by God, nor by me, Doctor." Hales first visited the mission on a rain-soaked night after hearing rumours of a leper chapel among the slums. He expected despair. What he found instead was tenderness. The sisters moved among the patients, with practiced care, binding hands, washing faces, spooning broth into trembling mouths. There was no fear in them, no masks, no gloves, only faith. "You should be cautious," Hales told Agnes gently as she cleaned a man's wounds by lamplight. She smiled faintly, her eyes the colour of faded parchment. "I wash in faith, Doctor. It burns less than carbolic." Later, as the candles guttered low, he watched her kneel beside a woman whose face was half hidden by bandages. The sister took her hand, kissed it softly, and whispered something he couldn't hear. The patient began to weep, not from pain, but from the shock of being touched. When Hales left the chapel that night, the rain had stopped, but the air was still thick with smoke and him. The city outside looked different, colder, yes, but also smaller, as if the world's true centre existed not in Westminster's marble halls, but here, in this forgotten room where mercy still dared to breathe. Weeks later, he returned with medicine and bandages, but when he reached the narrow street, the chapel door was sealed, the windows dark. A notice nailed to the gate bore the red stamp of the Board of Health. Premises condemned contagious cases within. No one ever saw Sister Agnes again. Some said the sisters were moved to a hospital in Kent, others said they stayed until the end, refusing to leave those they called family. Yet at night, when the wind shifted through Spitalfields, the sound of faint singing could still be heard, hymns in cracked voices, rising and falling with the breath of the dying, and sometimes, in the morning fog, a candle flickered behind the chapel's shattered window, as if someone inside still believed the sick deserved light. The mirror in Dr. Hales's room was small and round, mounted above the wash basin with a brass clasp that had long since tarnished. It was not the kind one admires oneself in. It was a tool, like a stethoscope or scalpel, used for shaving, for observation, for proof of existence. Yet, by the winter of 1877, he found himself looking into it more often than before, searching for something he could not name. The first time he noticed it, it was only a shadow, a faint, uneven patch along his cheek that caught the morning light differently. He leaned closer, rubbed it with a damp cloth, convinced it was soot from the fire, but it remained, pale and smooth, like wax pressed over skin. He told himself it was exhaustion. The hospital air was thick with chemical fumes. Carbolic dried the flesh, stripped the face of color. Still, the sight left a tremor in his stomach that he could not quite banish. The mirror became a judge. Each dawn, he stood before it, as the city's light crept through the fog, tracing the outline of his face with his fingertips. He checked for new blemishes, new stillnesses. His reflection stared back, the same tired eyes, the same gaunt cheeks, but beneath it all, an unease that deepened with every passing day. One evening, after a long day in the wards, he lingered in the dissection room long after the nurses had gone. The glass jars glimmered faintly in the lamplight, their contents adrift like pieces of memory. He caught his reflection again, this time in the curved surface of a jar, distorted, shimmering, inhuman. The liquid inside magnified his features into something unfamiliar. The face that stared back seemed calm, too calm. He turned away quickly, his chest tight. The disease preyed not only on the body but on imagination. He had seen it before in others, the paranoia, the self-examinations, the late-night confessions whispered to nurses. "Am I one of them?" they would ask. "Has it begun?" Now he understood how easily fear could mimic infection. But when he touched his cheek again that night, the skin felt colder than the rest. He said nothing to anyone. He redoubled his work instead, more rounds, more dissections, more records for the board. If he was ill, he would diagnose it himself. Yet even as he worked, he caught himself avoiding touch. When a nurse handed him an instrument, he hesitated before taking it. When a patient reached for his sleeve, he stepped back. It was in the mirror's reflection one morning that he finally saw her, the faint image of Sister Agnes standing behind him, her face soft with light. She said nothing, only raised a hand as if to bless him. He turned sharply, but the room was empty. The candle beside the basin flickered once, then went out. The next day, he covered the mirror with a white cloth. But that night, as the wind rattled the shutters, he swore he could hear a voice whispering faintly through the glass. Calm, patient, almost kind. "You are not sick," it said. "You are only becoming like them." And in that moment, Hales understood the cruelest truth of all. It was not the disease that erased a man, but the reflection of his own fear staring back until he vanished from himself. When morning came, he lifted the cloth again. The patch on his cheek was gone, or perhaps it had simply learned to hide where the light could not reach. He arrived with the fog, stepping off the night train at Euston with only a valise and a wool coat that smelled faintly of sea salt. The officials at customs said his name was Lars Odegaard, a sailor from Bergen, come to London seeking passage to the colonies. But when he presented his papers, one of the inspectors noticed the gloves' thick leather, worn smooth at the fingertips, despite the warmth of the station. At first, he spoke little. His English was halting, old-fashioned, learned from hymn books and ship prayers. "I am a carpenter," he told the officer, "and sometimes a fisherman." He smiled as he said it, though his lips barely moved. And when he reached for the pen to sign his entry form, the pen slipped twice between his fingers. The ink splattered across the page like blood. They sent him to Dr. Hales the following morning, along with a short note from the Port Authority. Subject exhibits numbness of extremities, unknown cause, possible frostbite. Hales found him sitting quietly in the examination room, hat in hand, looking at the tiled floor as though it might shift beneath him. His hair was fair and cut short, his eyes the pale grey of northern skies. "How long have you been at sea?" Hales asked. "Since boy," the man replied. "All my life, almost. But the sea no longer wants me." He unbuttoned his gloves at the doctor's request. What lay beneath was not frostbite. The fingers were smooth and discoloured, the nails thickened, the skin on the back of the hands patchy and dull. There was no swelling, no pain, only absence. Hales touched the man's wrist gently with a needle. "Do you feel that?" The sailor shook his head. "No," he said softly, "but I saw it." For days afterward the man stayed in the isolation wing, though he did not seem ill in the ordinary sense. He ate well, spoke little, and spent hours by the window watching the river's slow churn beyond the fog. When Hales visited, he asked about his homeland, about the fjords, the ice, the silence. "In my village," Lars said one evening, "they called it spedelsket, the sickness that takes the hands first. When it came, the priest would ring the church bell. Once for the body, once for the soul." "Did they treat it?" Hales asked. "They buried it," Lars replied. "The sick were taken to the island, St. Jürgen's hospital, a place where no one comes back." He smiled again, faintly, with a kind of tired pride. "I left before they could send me there. I thought maybe London would forget." Hales said nothing. He knew that London never forgot it, only hid what it feared until the next headline demanded remembrance. The sailor's condition worsened by degrees. First the hands, then the feet, until walking became slow and deliberate, as though each step was a negotiation with gravity. Yet through it all, he remained calm. "It doesn't hurt," he would say. "Only feels like falling asleep a little more each day." On his last night, a fog heavier than any that season rolled over the Thames, blanketing the ward in silence. When the nurses checked on him at dawn, they found his bed neatly made, his gloves folded on the pillow. The window was open, curtains billowing gently in the mist. The police searched the riverbank, but found nothing. Only a set of footprints leading to the water, and beside them, the faint impression of a hand pressed into the mud, smooth, unlined, and without fingerprints. Hales stood there long after the constables left, staring at that mark until the tide erased it. The fog hung low over the river, swallowing everything it touched. He thought of the bells Lars had spoken of, one for the body, one for the soul, and wondered which had rung for him, and which for London. The chamber smelled of damp wool and coal smoke, the scent of a nation arguing with itself. Outside, a January storm battered the Thames, rattling the windows of Westminster like restless ghosts. Inside, beneath the green lamps and the haze of pipe smoke, the question of contagion had reached the floor of the house. The galleries were full. Clerks shuffled papers, stenographers leaned close over their notes, and ministers whispered into one another's collars as if the disease itself might be listening. The word leprosy had not been spoken aloud in Parliament for more than 2 centuries, and yet tonight it sat between them like a living thing. Sir Alistair Pember stood first. His voice carried the calm authority of a man accustomed to speaking over storm and protest alike. "We must act decisively," he declared. "The Board of Health has confirmed multiple cases within the East End, and though I am assured that contagion is improbable, perception is reality. The Empire's capital cannot afford to appear diseased. Quarantine must be expanded." A murmur spread through the chamber, approval from some, discomfort from others. One younger MP, a doctor before he turned politician, rose from the backbenches. "Are we to exile our own citizens for the comfort of appearances?" he asked. "Surely the solution lies in sanitation and science, not seclusion." Pember's reply came smooth as polished brass. "Would you risk the city's safety for sentiment? These are not criminals, but neither are they ordinary subjects. Compassion, sir, must not blind us to prudence." The debate dragged through the evening. Reports from the docks were read aloud, numbers of sailors detained, asylums overcrowded, rumors of infection spreading to the workhouses. The name of Dr. Jonathan Hales appeared in one report, cited as a sympathetic observer of the afflicted. A few MPs exchanged uneasy glances. Sympathy, in that room, was beginning to sound like subversion. When Hales's letter to the board was read, the one urging that the patients be treated rather than hidden laughter broke out from the government benches. One member muttered, "He wants to baptize Contagion." Another replied, "Let him live among them then." By midnight, the matter was settled with the vote that history would later call the Sanitary Isolation Act of 1878. It granted the state power to remove and detain any citizen showing persistent signs of infectious disease inconsistent with public health. The phrase persistent signs was left deliberately vague. Outside, as the members filed into their carriages, the rain had turned to sleet. Hales waited in the shadows of the courtyard, his coat collar pulled high. He had stood through the entire debate unseen, summoned as a witness but never called. He watched the carriages roll past, the horses' hooves clattering like distant gunfire. He knew what would follow the recent: closures, the roundups, the fear disguised as law. London would call it victory, the papers would call it safety. But to Hales, it felt like another form of infection, one that spread not through touch, but through policy, through language, through the comfort of distance. As he walked back along the embankment, the clock of Street Stevens struck one. The river below was black and slow, reflecting the faint gold of Parliament's windows. Somewhere behind him, a voice called for a hansom cab. Another coughed. By the time the sound faded, the city had already begun to change, its compassion quarantined, its conscience sealed away in the name of progress. And beneath the storm, the Thames moved quietly, carrying both memory and disease out toward the sea. The museum's corridors were always cold, even in summer. They smelled faintly of alcohol, dust, and the quiet persistence of things preserved against decay. It was here, in the back rooms of the Royal College of Medicine, that Dr. Silas Wren worked the man the newspapers called the Collector. His title was honorary, his salary modest, but his influence greater than either suggested. When physicians discovered something unexplainable, a bone that healed wrong, a tumor with teeth, a patch of skin that refused to rot, they sent it to Wren. He made London's dead articulate. By the time leprosy entered public debate, Wren's shelves were already lined with the evidence of centuries. Shrunken organs, wax models, and labeled glass jars where the past floated, pale and suspended. It was said that no one remembered the city's diseases better than he did. Yet even he, when the first sealed crate arrived from Rotherhithe, hesitated before unlatching the lid. Inside lay 6 jars, each with a hand submerged in clear solution. The fingers curled delicately, as if mid-prayer. Each bore the faint, ghostly sheen of skin robbed of blood. The accompanying letter, signed by Dr. Hales himself, requested preservation for scientific study. At the bottom, in small script, was a final note: "These are the hands of the forgotten. Let them not be forgotten again." Wren read the line twice, then placed the paper aside. He was not an unfeeling man, only one accustomed to stillness. Emotion had no place in his trade. Every heartbeat was an intrusion. He catalogued the specimens carefully, writing in the ledger with his usual precision: Subject A, leprous tissue, female. Subject B, anesthetic degradation, male. When the work was done, he closed the book and stared at the hands through the glass. They seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, their whiteness almost luminous. That night, the building settled into silence. Rain tapped against the windows, and the faint ticking of the clock marked the slow passage of another London evening. Yet Wren could not leave. Something in those jars held him not horror, but recognition. The hands were graceful, unafraid, as though even death had respected their quiet endurance. He remembered his childhood in Southwark, the beggars outside the church who were never touched, the thin woman who sold flowers from beneath a shawl though her face was scarred by pale patches. He had been told not to look at her, and so he learned to look away. Now, decades later, her face had returned not as flesh, but as memory suspended in liquid clarity. When the clock struck midnight, Wren took up his lantern and descended to the cellar. The archive extended beneath the museum like catacombs, rows of cabinets stretching into shadow. He placed the new specimens on an empty shelf between Asiatic cholera, 1832, and scrofula, 1847. The space seemed too quiet after he closed the case. Before leaving, he stood for a moment, lantern raised, surrounded by the silent witnesses of the city's history. The glass reflected his face 100 times, over distorted, refracted, multiplied. For the first time, he thought how thin the line was between the collector and the collected. When he finally extinguished the light, the cellar remained aglow with faint reflections. The jars caught the last trace of firelight and held it, as if the hands within refused to fade entirely. Outside, the wind swept through the streets, carrying the sound of distant church bells. To anyone listening, it might have seemed the city itself was tolling softly for its own specimens, the ones still breathing. She was 14, maybe 15, though no one knew for certain. The records listed her only as patient 73, found wandering near the Limehouse docks one night in the rain, a shawl clutched around her shoulders and her feet bare. The constable who brought her in said she didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't even shiver. When asked her name, she pressed her fingers to her lips and whispered, "It's gone." The nurses at the Chatham Asylum called her the girl by the window because that was where she spent every waking hour seated on the narrow sill, her chin resting on the cold glass, watching the world she no longer belonged to. Outside, the orchard sloped down toward the river, where barges moved slow and black through the mist. In spring, the apple trees bloomed, but she never noticed the color. She looked only at the sky, waiting for something that never arrived. Dr. Hales first saw her during his monthly inspection. She was smaller than he expected, thin, bird-like, with eyes that seemed too large for her face. Her hair had been cut short by the attendants, uneven at the edges. She didn't flinch when he approached, though she turned slightly, as if to hear the sound of his steps more clearly. "She doesn't feel pain," the nurse explained softly. "She cut her hand last week and didn't even notice until she saw the blood." Hales took the girl's wrist gently. Her skin was cool, almost translucent, and beneath it the veins glimmered faintly blue. "Do you remember your name?" he asked. She shook her head. "The river took it." "What river?" "All of them," she murmured. He examined her carefully, but the usual marks of the disease were subtle: a pale patch at the jawline, a slight distortion of the fingers, the faint beginning of numbness across the cheek. Yet there was something else, something unrecorded, a calm that felt unnatural in someone so young. He returned often in the weeks that followed, more than he admitted to the staff. Sometimes he brought her small gifts: a comb, a bit of ribbon, a page torn from an old picture book. She took them politely, set them on the windowsill beside her, and went on watching the sky. "You should go outside," he told her once. She smiled faintly. "I am outside," she said, her breath fogging the glass. When summer came, the Board of Health ordered the Chatham Asylum expanded. Some of the older patients were transferred to make room for new arrivals. On the morning of the transfer, Hales found her room empty. The window stood open, the curtain fluttering softly in the wind. On the sill lay the ribbon he had given her, tied into a small knot, and beside it a single apple blossom. No one saw her leave. The guards at the gate swore no one had passed. Some said she'd wandered down to the river, following the sound of the bells. Others believed she had simply stepped through the glass into whatever world she had been staring at all along. Weeks later, a fisherman claimed to have found a shawl caught in the reeds near Gravesend, faded blue, damp with rain, still smelling faintly of soap. When Hales heard, he said nothing. He only looked out the window of his own study that evening, toward the river curling black through London, and thought of her sitting quietly somewhere beyond its reach. The nurses never cleaned her room. The bed remained made, the air faintly sweet with dust and memory. Sometimes, on quiet afternoons, they swore they heard the faint tap of fingers against glass, soft, rhythmic, like a child asking to come home. By the spring of 1878, London had learned a new phrase: imperial disease. It appeared in board memoranda, in parliamentary briefs, in sermons whispered from pulpits. It was not born from the city's filth, they said, but from its reach. The empire had gathered more than lands and riches. It had gathered contagion, from Calcutta to Cape Town, from Singapore to Jamaica. The colonies sent back not just tea and sugar, but fevers, parasites, and invisible inheritances that clung to skin and bone. And now, leprosy, that ancient spectre, was being called the empire's own reflection. Ships still arrived at the docks each morning, their hulls swollen with goods, their crews hollow-eyed from months at sea. The quarantine officers inspected them perfunctorily, dipping thermometers into the air, measuring the temperature of fear more than of flesh. Any man with a mark on his face was marked twice, once by illness, once by suspicion. The papers published tallies of imported cases, a phrase that made human beings sound like cargo. Dr. Hales read these reports by the dim light of his study, his hands trembling over the pages. He had begun to see patterns not in the disease, but in the way the city spoke about it. The language of commerce had replaced the language of compassion. Outbreak had become surplus. Quarantine became containment. The sick were counted in columns beside barrels of salt, pork, and crates of wool. The empire was cataloguing its ghosts. A letter arrived from Bombay that week from one of Hales's old students, now employed at the Grant Medical College. The handwriting was hurried, the ink blotched by humidity. "The wards here are full," it read. "There is a village outside the city, all lepers, all living in the dust. The government sends rice once a week. No medicine. They call it mercy, the same mercy, I think, you now offer at home." He folded the letter carefully and set it beside his journal, where similar correspondences from Ceylon and Malaya had already gathered like unanswered prayers. It struck him that the disease was not travelling from the colonies to London, as the papers claimed, but outward, carried in ideas, in habits, in the imperial instinct to divide the clean from the unclean. That summer, a lecture was held at the Royal Society on the spread of leprosy across the civilized world. Hales sat in the back, listening as the speaker, a portly man with a gold watch chain, described the illness as the moral tax of empire. Slides were shown, photographs of patients from India, from Mauritius, from the London docks. The audience murmured their fascination, taking notes as if cataloguing curiosities. When the lights came up, Hales rose and asked quietly, "And what of the men who built the ships, who carried the crates, who buried the dead? What tax do they pay?" No one answered. Afterward, he walked home along the river, where the lights of the wharves trembled on the water like fevered stars. He passed warehouses stacked with goods stamped "Made in Empire," and he thought how fitting it was that even the sickness now bore the same mark. London had long called itself the heart of the world, but hearts, Hales knew, could rot from the inside while still appearing strong, and perhaps that was the truest contagion of all, not leprosy, not fever, but the quiet conviction that one could export suffering and never inhale it back. By autumn, new asylum walls were rising in Kent, modelled after those in India. The same architecture, the same silence. Only the faces inside differed: brown there, pale here. The design of fear was consistent. The letter arrived folded twice, sealed with black wax, and stamped from the port of Madras. It was addressed not to Dr. Hales directly, but to the Board of Health, forwarded, then misplaced, then finally handed to him by a clerk who muttered that it concerned the colonies. The handwriting was uneven, its lines slanting as if written on a ship in motion. Across the top margin someone had penciled in faintly, "From Reverend Thomas C. Marlowe, missionary, Tamil Coast." Hales broke the seal carefully. Inside, he found not a report but a confession. "To the authorities in London," it began, "I write not for the sake of record but of conscience. I am no longer certain whether what we call mercy is mercy at all." The Reverend described his post, a small leper settlement 2 miles beyond the mission compound, built by British decree, administered by local police. He had arrived with a crate of Bibles and 2 bottles of carbolic. "They told me," he wrote, "that the disease would make saints of them, for suffering purifies." But I see no saints here, only those purified out of existence. He wrote of the women who carried water from a distant well, their hands wrapped in rags to hide the missing fingers, of the children born without pain, learning to walk on feet, already half numb, of the men who sat by the wall each evening, staring toward the church they could no longer enter. We have given them prayers, he wrote, and in return they give us silence. I have begun to fear that they are the ones closer to heaven. Hales read the letter aloud to no one, the words echoing faintly in the stillness of his office. The tone was not of rebellion but of surrender, a man peeling faith away from duty. Further down, the letter grew darker. The missionary admitted to burning bodies without ceremony, of burying the dead in unmarked pits when the tide carried disease too near the village. I have baptized corpses, he confessed, and I no longer remember the words. Each day I feel less like a shepherd and more like the warden of an invisible prison. At the bottom, in handwriting that trembled across the page, was one final paragraph. Please tell them in London that we are not fighting a disease, but an idea that some lives are meant to be clean and others quarantined. Tell them I am sick, though not in the flesh. My prayers have turned to dust in my mouth. If I am to be judged, let it be for speaking too late. The letter ended without farewell. Hales folded the pages back into their envelope and stared at the seal the missionary's cross pressed deep into black wax. Outside, rain beat against the window like impatient fingers. He could almost see the man at his desk, sweating under the tropical sun, ink running down his arm as he tried to describe something too vast for salvation. He filed the letter among his private notes, under a heading he had recently begun using, moral pathologies, but he never sent a reply. Weeks later, another envelope arrived from Madras, this time from the governor's office. It contained only a single line: the Reverend Thomas Marlowe passed from fever while in service to God and Crown. Hales read it twice. Then, almost without thinking, he took the earlier letter and placed it between the pages of his medical journal, a record of the body preserving the confession of a soul. That night, when he walked home through the London fog, the gas lamps flickered like distant candles, and he wondered, not for the first time, how many prayers the Empire had burned in the name of cleanliness. The asylum stood like a fortress on the edge of Chatham, a long, grey block of stone surrounded by iron fencing and hedges trimmed too neatly to feel alive. Yet within those walls, past the locked gates and the whitewashed corridors, there was a garden, small, rectangular, and walled on all sides. It existed as a strange defiance of its surroundings, a patch of green in a place built to forget colour. They called it the Garden of Mercy. The name had started as a joke among the nurses. Patients were rarely allowed there, and when they were, it was only under strict supervision. But over time, it became something else, a space of ritual, of routine, of quiet rebellion. The sick planted seeds with hands that could barely grip a trowel, and somehow things grew. When Dr. Hales visited in early spring, he found a handful of patients bent over the soil, their movements slow but deliberate. The air smelled of damp earth and soap. A thin sunlight fell through the bars of the surrounding wall, striping the ground like a cage of light. He recognized one of them, an older man named Pritchard, a former dock worker whose skin had turned the color of parchment. Pritchard had once served as Hales's surgical assistant before the numbness began. "Good morning, sir," the man said, straightening with difficulty. His gloves were threadbare, soiled dark beneath the seams. "We've coaxed the roses back again." Hales knelt beside him, brushing his fingers over the fragile stalks. "You shouldn't strain yourself," he said. Pritchard smiled. "The roses don't mind, and neither do I." He pointed toward a patch of marigolds near the wall. "They said nothing would grow here. The earth was too tired. But look, even the dirt's learned patience." The doctor said nothing. He felt a strange heaviness in his throat, something between pride and sorrow. At the far end of the garden, a young woman sat in a wicker chair, sketching quietly. Her face was hidden by a wide straw hat, the brim trembling slightly in the wind. Hales recognized her from the ward notes. Margaret Dorr, deceased, March 1875. For a moment, the world tilted. Then he realized it was another woman, one of the new patients, perhaps wearing the hat passed down through the years, as things so often were here. She looked up and met his gaze. Her eyes were clear, steady. "Doctor," she said softly, "did you know flowers don't feel pain when they're cut?" I asked the sisters. They said it's because they have no nerves. Hales swallowed. "Perhaps that's a kindness." "Yes," she said, "but it also means they never know they're dying." When he left the garden, the smell of roses followed him down the corridor, clinging faintly to his coat. He passed a row of open doors, each leading to rooms nearly identical, white sheets, iron beds, a single cross above each frame. From one of them came the sound of humming, from another the soft scrape of a chair against stone. The asylum was quieter now than it had ever been. That evening, he recorded his visit in his ledger. Patients appear calmer outdoors. Physical improvement uncertain. Spirits improved. Roses thriving. Then, after a long pause, he added, "Perhaps the roses are the healthiest among us." Weeks later, a nurse sent word that Pritchard had passed peacefully in his sleep. When Hales returned to the asylum, he found a small wooden sign planted at the edge of the garden, carved in unsteady letters. He helped the roses live. Spring had deepened, the marigolds burned gold in the sunlight, and the roses had bloomed red, deeper and more vivid than any he'd ever seen. They swayed gently in the breeze, as if bowing to the memory of all who had once touched the soil without feeling it. And for the first time in months, Dr. Hales let himself breathe. They said he had been a painter, once a modest exhibitor at the Royal Academy before his hands betrayed him. His name was Thomas Layton, and he arrived at the Chatham Asylum in the summer of 1878, carrying only a wooden box of brushes, 2 blank canvases, and a letter signed by a patron who had long since stopped visiting. The disease had already taken the feeling from his fingertips, but not his hunger for color. At first, the nurses didn't know what to make of him. He refused medication, rarely spoke, and spent hours staring at the pale walls of his cell. Then one morning they found him in the corridor, painting with improvised pigments made from soot, soap, and crushed petals from the asylum garden. His subject was the door, the very door that locked him in, a grey archway rimmed with light. Dr. Hales came to see it himself. The smell of linseed oil and disinfectant mingled uneasily in the corridor. Layton stood beside his work, the brush trembling between 2 gloved fingers. "It's not a door anymore," he said quietly. "It's a threshold. Every illness is." Hales studied the painting. The light spilling through the arch looked almost holy. "You shouldn't strain yourself," he said. Layton smiled faintly. "Doctor, if I cannot feel my hands, at least I can still feel the light." Permission was granted for him to paint, so long as it soothed the patients. Soon he was given a small corner of the ward, a windowless cell-turned studio, lit by a single gas lamp. He painted constantly. Walls, scraps of linen, discarded sheets, anything that would hold color. The nurses brought him scraps of ochre, burnt umber, charcoal dust, and petals from the asylum's garden. He mixed them with water and candle wax, creating hues soft as memory. His subjects were the other patients. A woman reading with bandaged hands, an old sailor leaning against a window he could no longer see through, a child asleep beneath a quilt, patched from hospital rags. He painted them not as they were, but as they seemed to him serene, luminous, already half removed from the world. Within months, the gallery at Chatham, a narrow corridor used for storage, was transformed. The walls glowed with quiet faces, their eyes neither pleading nor resigned, but calm. The staff began to avoid the hallway at night. They said the eyes followed them in the lamplight. When Hales asked Layton why he painted them so peaceful, the man replied, "Because that's how London wants them, beautiful in silence. But I paint them this way for myself, so I'll remember they were still alive when I looked." That winter, his health declined rapidly. His hands stiffened. His jaw began to slacken when he spoke, yet he continued painting, holding the brush between both palms when his fingers failed. The last work he completed was small, no bigger than a book cover. It showed a row of roses blooming through stone. On the back, in faint pencil, he had written, "The cure for suffering is witness." When he died, the sisters wrapped his brushes in linen and placed them beside him. Hales ensured the paintings were not burned with his belongings. Instead, he had them stored in the cellar of the Royal College of Medicine under a new label, Anonymous Works by Patients of Chatham Asylum, 1878-79. Years later, long after the wards were emptied and the garden overgrown, one of those paintings resurfaced in a London market. The dealer had no name for the artist, only a note, found in the ruins of an old hospital. The face in the portrait was calm, pale, and touched with light, a woman sitting before an unseen window. Her eyes seemed to look beyond the canvas, towards something vast and merciful, and beneath the cracked paint, faintly visible when the light struck just right, was a single inscription scratched into the pigment. I felt it again, the color of pain. The rain came suddenly, a steady drum against the slate roofs of the asylum. It filled the courtyards with shallow puddles that reflected the gas lamps like molten silver. The patients, confined to their rooms by order of the Board of Health, pressed their faces to the glass, listening to the rhythm, the soft, endless tapping that marked each passing hour. In that sound, they found a kind of solace, a heartbeat of the city itself, distant yet insistent. Dr. Hales moved through the corridors, boots echoing softly on the damp floors as he checked on the wards. The air smelled faintly of carbolic and wet stone, the mixture sharp enough to sting the eyes. In the upper halls, the girls and women hummed quietly, their voices nearly drowned by the storm. He paused outside the chapel door, hearing the familiar cadence of prayer through the cracks in the wood. Sister Agnes had returned, though none could say how, and she led the patients in hymns that blended with the rain. "O Lord, have mercy. O Lord, hear us." The refrain seemed to wash over the walls, rising and falling in tandem with the storm. For a moment, Hales felt it inside him, a kind of trembling resonance that made him remember why he had become a doctor. These were not merely bodies to be catalogued, nor symptoms to be observed. They were lives still present in the quiet, still insisting upon themselves. In room 14, a boy pressed his fingers to the glass, tracing lines in the condensation. Outside, the rain streaked down in silver threads. He whispered a prayer aloud, though the words were broken and uneven, carried by the wind that slipped under the door. A patient across the hall joined him softly, adding another line to the invisible chain. Soon, the entire ward hummed together, voices overlapping in a fragile harmony. Hales closed his notebook and leaned against the wall. He thought of the woman from Bombay, of the seamstress in Soho, of the sailor from Norway, all of them listening to the world in their own way, finding the rhythms of survival amid silence. Prayer, he realized, was not merely for the soul. It was a shield, a way to mark existence when the city had decided you were invisible. The storm intensified, wind rattling the window panes as the Thames below swelled against its banks. Lanterns on the docks flickered like dying stars. Hales imagined the river carrying news, rumor, disease, and fear to every corner of the empire. Somewhere upstream, children splashed in flooded streets, ignorant of the whispers that traveled faster than any man could measure. At the hour of Vespers, Sister Agnes extinguished the lamps in the chapel one by one, leaving only the altar candle to flicker. The rain softened to a drizzle, and the patient voices trailed off, leaving an echo of syllables suspended in the air. Hales stayed, listening to the residual hum, aware that the sound of prayer, like the rain, could not be contained. It seeped through the walls, into the corridors, down to the gates, and out into the sleeping city. When he finally stepped into the night, the storm had passed. The streets gleamed with wet reflections, and the distant bells of a parish church tolled slowly. Hales walked home, his coat damp, his boots leaving dark prints on the cobblestones. In the hush between the drops, he understood that the city itself had learned to pray, or perhaps it had learned to listen to the quiet insistence of lives the Empire would have preferred to forget. And somewhere, above the rooftops, the storm lingered, a whispered reminder that even the heaviest rain could not wash away the sound of those who refused to be silent. She moved quietly through the corridors of the townhouse on Fleet Street, a tray of tea balanced in her hands, her steps careful, measured. Her name was Annabel Crowther, though no one in the house would have guessed it. She had worked for the same family for 3 years, learning to speak softly, to smile on cue, and to carry burdens that no one would notice until they fell. But Annabel carried another burden, one that could not be brushed aside, one that made every touch a danger. It had begun in the spring, a tiny blotch on the back of her hand. She ignored it, thinking it a rash from soap or the sun, until the patch spread, pale and persistent. When the fingertips began to stiffen, she understood. She had heard of the disease, whispered of it in the alleys of Whitechapel, the word leprosy rolling through the fog like a curse. She hid it. Always gloves, even in summer, always gloves. She served the master of the house breakfast that morning, pouring tea from the silver pot, the cup trembling slightly in her gloved fingers. The master, a man of routine and polite blindness, never noticed the way she handled the delicate china. The mistress, focused on her correspondence, did not see the patch of discolored skin near Annabel's wrist. Even the children, playing quietly by the hearth, were oblivious. When the letters arrived from the Board of Health about the rising cases in London, Annabel read them silently in her room, the words flickering in the candlelight. Quarantine enforced. Exposure risk. Immediate containment advised. She pressed the page against her chest, feeling the heat of it. She could not leave the house for fear of discovery. She could not work without gloves for fear of touch. She could not speak for fear that words might betray her. One afternoon, the mistress of the house called her to help with a sewing project. Annabel knelt beside the chair, her fingers moving with the practiced skill of someone trained in silence. The mistress's hands brushed against hers once, briefly, and Annabel froze. The warmth of another hand was alien, terrifying, and fleeting. She felt the pulse of her own body, the dull ache of nerves that no longer responded. She smiled professionally, politely, and continued her work. At night, in the small attic room she called her own, she removed her gloves carefully, folding them on the table like talismans. She traced the blotches on her skin with trembling fingers, noting the numbness that had crept higher with each week. She prayed softly, not for healing, but for discretion, for invisibility, for mercy. The servants whispered among themselves, unaware of her secret. They spoke of the fever that had passed through the East End, of the rumors of disease aboard ships, of the strange cases in the hospitals. Annabel said nothing. She kept her distance, moved with the shadowed rhythm of the house, and left no mark. One evening, she looked out the small window at the Passat, rooftops slick with rain. She imagined the city beneath her, oblivious, bustling, alive, and she knew she would remain hidden, just another shadow in the house, carrying the quiet knowledge of what she could not show, what she must never reveal. In the Empire's capital, the plague moved, unseen and insidious. And in the narrow alleyways of London, in the rooms where candlelight trembled over polished wood, one young housemaid carried her own small secret, a silent witness to the disease that touched lives, and yet could not be touched itself. The city held its breath in the days following the newspaper's first report. Londoners woke to a new terror, one that had no form, no smell, yet pressed on their chests with the weight of inevitability. Rumours travelled faster than the morning omnibus, faster than the newsboys' cries. Leprosy has returned. The docks are infected. The poor are carriers. Words scuttled through the streets like vermin, invisible but everywhere. Bakers scrubbed counters with vinegar until their hands cracked. Shopkeepers hung lengths of fabric soaked in carbolic over the windows to protect themselves from contagion, though no one could say whether the smell killed disease or simply offered the illusion of safety. Children were pulled from school at the first whisper of spots on the skin, their mothers clutching their coats and shaking their heads at anyone who looked too closely. Even the clergy, whose duty it was to comfort, began to avoid touching the sick during evening visits, crossing themselves. Instead, in Whitechapel, the rumors became a living thing. Doors closed silently behind families who had once greeted the dawn with laundry and bread. Carriages avoided narrow streets, fearing that a passing hand might carry more than dust. One baker was driven from his stall after a sailor saw a pale mark on his forearm. The man insisted he had not touched anyone, yet suspicion alone was contagious enough. Dr. Hales watched it all from the corridors of Chatham. He had known fear before, in epidemics of typhus and cholera. But this was different. The panic was not born of illness alone. It had grown into a creature of its own, fed by the city's desire for order, its need for distance from the suffering it could not contain. Each day, more patients were brought in, not necessarily sicker, but more anxious, more convinced of the world's hostility. The newspapers continued to fan the flames. Headlines like "Leprosy among the poor" and "The Eastern Plague Returns," printed on paper already yellowed with fear. Editorials debated morality and policy, wondering whether charity was a crime and isolation a duty. Outside the press offices, crowds gathered, discussing with hushed voices the invisible enemy that might already be touching them, watching them, waiting for them to falter. By the third week, the panic had reached its own rhythm. Streetcar conductors refused passengers with marks on their hands, public houses locked their doors to anyone coughing or pale, and dock workers were questioned repeatedly about contact with foreign crews. Even those untouched by the disease carried the anxiety in their bodies, trembling hands, shallow breaths, eyes scanning for unseen stains. Hales noted it carefully in his ledger. The fear spreads faster than the infection. Public panic manifests through avoidance, gossip, and a subtle violence toward the unmarked poor. He knew that for many, fear was more contagious than leprosy itself. At night, as rain fell softly against the panes of his office, he imagined the city asleep beneath a veil of dread. Somewhere, in a darkened alley, a child huddled against the cold. Somewhere else, a mother pressed her gloved hands to her son's face, terrified of what she could not see. And in the quiet, the river carried the distant toll of bells, not for the dead or the sick, but for a city that had forgotten how to look with compassion. The panic would not end with policy, nor with medicine. It would live in whispers, in avoidance, in the way Londoners walked past one another, afraid to touch, afraid to speak. And it was in that fear, Hales realized, that the true disease had taken hold, one far more pervasive than any leprous hand could ever reach. Dr. Hales had always believed in observation. In his mind, the microscope revealed truths that the world might prefer to ignore, that facts could guide policy and mercy alike. Yet, by the spring of 1878, he realized that science alone could not contain what London was feeling. Fear, he noted in his ledger, had a contagiousness all its own, spreading through whispers, newspapers, and the glance of a neighbor. He spent hours in the laboratory, cataloging tissue samples, mapping the progression of the disease, measuring the numbness in fingers and toes. Each slide revealed pale patches, microscopic colonies, a faint glow beneath the microscope lens. On the table beside him lay specimens from the docks, from Chatham, from Mile End, jars of skin, of tissue, of what once had been alive. They floated in clear alcohol, suspended and still, catalogued with precision. And yet, for all the precision, Hales knew the truth. The city's panic could not be measured. There was no gauge for the way mothers pulled children close when a cough sounded down the street, for the way tradesmen scrubbed their doorsteps thrice daily in vinegar and soap, for the way even the clergy began to cross themselves at the sight of a pale face. Fear had replaced empathy. Rumor had replaced observation. He remembered the girl by the window at Chatham, patient 73, and how she had pressed her hands against the glass, searching for a world she could no longer touch. He remembered the seamstress in Soho, her gloves always in place, her fingers numb yet steady, and he thought of the sailor from Norway, whose pale fingers had traced invisible lines in the air, as if marking boundaries no one else could see. All of them were victims, not only of the disease but of the city's reaction to it. Hales made notes that he never intended to publish. Fear amplifies, persists, and multiplies in the absence of control. Isolation enforces panic more effectively than infection ever could. Public perception drives compliance. Rumor becomes more powerful than medicine. He understood now that the true epidemic was the one that had already spread to every household, every office, every street. The fear of touch, of proximity, of the unknown. Even in the wards, he saw it. Patients huddled silently in their beds, not because the disease commanded it, but because the city's panic had seeped in, whispering that even their caretakers might turn away. Nurses wore extra gloves, even when unnecessary. Doctors hesitated to touch a hand that looked pale. The wards, intended as spaces of safety and recovery, had become miniature London streets, full of caution, avoidance, and whispered dread. Hales walked home one evening through the fog, the gas lamps faintly illuminating the slick cobbles. The river, black and silent, reflected the city's lights in fractured strips. Somewhere, a child cried. Somewhere, a mother whispered a prayer she no longer believed in. And he realized that science, for all its rigor, had no hold over what the city now feared most, its own shadows. At his desk later that night, he wrote the final line for that day's observations. The disease is biological. The contagion of fear is moral, social, and unstoppable. Until the city learns to look without trembling, the true sickness will never be cured. He set down his pen and stared at the microscope. Through the lens, the tissue remained unchanged, pale, inert, incapable of motion. Outside, however, London moved differently, alive with panic, its heartbeat uneven, its pulse running faster than any pathogen he had ever seen. And in that rhythm, he understood. The Empire had already lost the battle it refused to name. The carriage rolled quietly down Whitehall, the wheels barely whispering against the wet cobblestones. Gas lamps stretched like timid sentinels into the fog, their light refracting in small, trembling circles upon the slick stone. Dr. Hales sat stiffly inside, gloves pressed to his knees, trying not to breathe too deeply. The summons had come unexpectedly, a note from the royal household requesting his presence. The Queen's physician wishes to confer regarding the recent reports of leprosy in London. No address, no time, only that a carriage would fetch him. He arrived at the palace without ceremony, ushered into a small study lined with oak shelves and the faint scent of cedar. A fire burned low, giving warmth that did little to mask the chill creeping in from the tall windows. There, standing beside the hearth, was the Queen's physician, a man of polished manners, his hair streaked with grey, eyes sharp with authority. He gestured for Hales to sit. "Dr. Hales," the physician began, voice smooth and measured, "we are troubled by reports of a disease long thought absent from our capital. You have seen it firsthand, have you not?" Hales nodded. "I have. Several cases at Chatham and Rotherhithe. The patients are already under observation, though the numbers are rising." The physician's hands were folded neatly before him. "You understand the implications?" Hales swallowed. "If public knowledge spreads, panic will follow. The disease itself is slow, but fear moves quickly." The man inclined his head. "Indeed, and yet the Crown cannot ignore it. The Empire's image depends upon both the reality of health and the perception of control. We require facts, Doctor, not conjecture. We require data and documentation. The public must believe that all measures are being taken not merely for the infected, but for all citizens of London." Hales remembered the girl by the window, the seamstress of Soho, the sailor from Norway. He thought of the hands he had held, numb and pale, the eyes that watched without fear. And the patients themselves? He asked. Does their suffering not matter? The physician paused, as though weighing an uncomfortable truth. Their suffering is unfortunate, but secondary. The empire endures, the individual is less permanent. Hales closed his eyes briefly. He had seen the truth of that statement in the wards, in the public panic, in the silence of families who turned away. They are not merely statistics, he said softly. They are alive. They feel what remains to be felt. And yet the city fears them, as if they were already dead. A long silence filled the room. The fire hissed once, then settled. The physician spoke at last. Dr. Hales, you have performed admirably. Continue your work. Document everything. Ensure containment. But remember, discretion is as important as medicine. If the public learns too much, the empire's authority will waver, and London will panic further. We cannot allow fear to spread faster than the disease itself. Hales nodded, the weight of the order pressing against his chest. When he left, the carriage carried him back through streets slick with rain and fog. Lanterns flickered in the mist, and the city seemed to watch him silently. Somewhere, a child coughed. Somewhere, a mother whispered a prayer for hands that could no longer touch. He returned to the wards with the Queen's physician's words ringing in his ears. The empire demanded secrecy. The city demanded calm. The patients demanded care. Yet all three could not be satisfied at once. The river beyond the windows carried the sound of distant bells, and Hales understood, as he often did at night, that the empire itself was sick not with leprosy, but with the fear it refused to face. That evening, he wrote in his ledger, "Control over perception has become more urgent than control over pathology. The disease is less dangerous than the knowledge of it. The empire survives, yet humanity is quietly quarantined alongside the sick." The colony lay beyond the high walls of Chatham, where the river bent sharply and the fog hung thick as wool. From the road, it looked like a small village forgotten by the world, its buildings low, slate-roofed, and weathered by salt and wind. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their boots echoing against the cobblestones, eyes scanning for anyone attempting to enter or leave. Inside, the air carried a strange mixture of brine, damp earth, and the faint, sharp tang of disinfectant, the signature of a city attempting to wash itself clean while leaving some of its citizens behind. Dr. Hales had visited the colony more times than he could count, yet each arrival felt like stepping into a new world. The patients, men and women of all ages, moved slowly along narrow pathways, their hands gloved or bandaged, faces pale against the stone and fog. Some bent over small gardens, planting seeds and tending what little could grow. Others sat quietly in the sunless courtyards, watching, listening, waiting. There was a rhythm here, separate from London, governed by rules that outsiders could not perceive. The colony had been established years before, when the disease was first whispered about among dock workers and sailors. The authorities had designed it with rigid efficiency. Dormitories lined in neat rows, a small infirmary, a chapel with high windows that let in grey light, and gardens meant to occupy the hands and minds of the residents. But no blueprint could contain fear, and no wall could protect the colony from the isolation that London demanded. Hales walked among the patients, noting their condition, recording the subtle changes in skin, the patches of numbness spreading along fingers and toes. Yet what struck him most was not the disease itself, but the quiet dignity of those who lived with it. He stopped by a bench where an old sailor rested, his hands folded, pale fingers curled gently over each other. "Morning," Hales said softly. The sailor turned, eyes steady. "Morning, Doctor. The tide is coming in later today. Do you want to go down to the river?" Hales asked, though he knew the answer. "No," the man said. "It's better to watch from here. Let the city carry on without me." Further along, a young woman bent over a plot of soil, planting marigolds and lavender. Hales recognized her from his earlier visits. Patient 52, a seamstress from Whitechapel. She looked up briefly, smiled faintly, then returned to her work. "The flowers will bloom," she said simply, "even here." The chapel bell tolled, soft and distant, signaling evening prayers. Patients filed slowly into the stone-walled space, forming a line of quiet motion. Sister Agnes, or someone who took her place, guided them with gentle words. The air was thick with incense and the faint smell of wet clothing, yet the voices, murmured in prayer, carried warmth. Hales lingered near the entrance, notebook in hand. He observed, recorded, and tried to reconcile the science he knew with the humanity before him. The Empire saw only numbers and containment, but here life persisted in subtle acts, planting a flower, holding a hand, whispering a prayer. As night fell and the fog rolled down from the river, Hales left the colony, the gates closing behind him with a soft clang. He looked back once at the dim lights inside windows glowing faintly against the dark. For a moment, he imagined the city itself beyond the walls, bustling, oblivious, yet strangely tethered to this hidden world. He wrote in his ledger later that night, "The colony exists in silence, yet it hums with life." Here, the Empire's fear meets the resilience of the human spirit. Disease may be present, but so is dignity, and that is something no wall can quarantine. He was small, smaller than most children his age, and yet he moved with a quiet determination that startled those around him. Born into the shadow of Mile End's tenements, he had known illness almost from the start. His mother had kept him wrapped, swaddled, away from neighbors and relatives alike, fearing what she had already seen in the streets, the pale patches, the numb fingers, the whispers that made children strangers to one another. But unlike the others, this child, Samuel Worthing, remembered touch. From the moment he could walk, he sought the warmth of hands, the press of a parent's palm, the softness of cloth against his skin. When his fingers first began to lose sensation, he clutched his mother's hand harder, memorizing the curve of her knuckles, the texture of her calloused palms. Even as the disease claimed his fingertips, he never forgot the sensation of being held. That memory became a lifeline, a quiet rebellion against the isolation the city demanded. Dr. Hales first met Samuel at Chatham when the boy was 7. He watched from the doorway as the child approached a group of patients, reaching out with trembling hands to touch the fabric of their clothing, their gloved fingers. Hales expected recoil, avoidance, the instinctive horror that had gripped every other adult. Instead, the patients allowed him to touch, to trace lines across sleeves, collars, and cuffs. Something about his innocence and the memory of touch he carried compelled them to respond. The boy told Hales stories in broken sentences, fragments of games, songs, and prayers. "This is how I remember," he said once, lifting a gloved hand to trace the edge of a chair. "I feel it, even if it isn't there. The warmth, the curves, the shape of someone's hand in mine." Nurses and attendants marveled quietly. Samuel seemed to bridge the chasm between the afflicted and the world outside. He did not fear touch. He did not recoil. Even when his own skin began to peel, pale and waxen, he pressed forward, remembering the world in its textures, the rough edge of a windowsill, the soft fold of a blanket, the warmth of another child's shoulder. At night, when the ward grew silent and the gas lamps flickered low, he would sit by the window, pressing his hands against the cold glass. He traced invisible patterns, replaying the memory of every hand that had ever held him. In dreams, he walked streets where people reached out and touched him freely, a world untouched by fear, unbroken by rumor, where touch was not a crime. One evening, Hales watched him press a fingertip against the hand of a nurse. Careful, gentle. "It's not gone," he whispered. "It remembers." Later, alone in his quarters, the doctor wrote in his ledger, "The child retains what the city has lost, memory of touch, memory of intimacy. His fingers carry knowledge, not of disease, but of connection." He reminds us that humanity exists even in the absence of sensation. Weeks passed. Samuel grew taller, more deliberate in his movements. He learned to help other children, guiding them, showing them how to remember touch through the weight of a shared blanket, the pressure of a wrist held firmly for a moment. In doing so, he became more than a patient. He became a conduit, a whisper of humanity that the empire had tried to quarantine. The city beyond Chatham remained fearful, rumor-driven, and distant. But within the walls, in the hands of a child who remembered, the world still had a pulse, quiet, persistent, and insistently alive. London moved on, as it always did, indifferent to the quiet suffering threading its alleys and streets. The city's heartbeat was measured in carriages and footfalls, in the clatter of streetcars and the whispers of gossip. Yet beneath the gaslight and the smoke, beneath the ceaseless commerce, there were lives it had already forgotten, pale, bandaged, and unseen. The poor, the afflicted, the exiled, they walked among the living, yet were marked by absence. Dr. Hales often thought of the women in Soho, the seamstresses who wore gloves even in the warmth of summer, their hands numb and precise. He thought of the children in Mile End, tracing invisible patterns on fogged glass, the memory of touch preserved like a secret talisman. He thought of the sailor from Norway, who had wandered into the river mist as if to escape both fear and memory. All of them were invisible to the city, yet their presence shaped it as surely as tides shape the banks of the Thames. In Fleet Street, the newspaper offices hummed with activity. Headlines about leprosy were replaced with floods, scandals, and parliamentary votes. The public absorbed each story, then discarded it, moving on with hurried lives and preoccupied minds. The afflicted were rarely mentioned, except as footnotes or cautionary tales. Their existence was acknowledged only to be ignored, their suffering recorded only to vanish into the footnotes of bureaucracy. Hales walked the wards late at night, past the beds of patients who slept with gloves still on, whose faces were pale as candlelight, and whose breaths whispered quietly against the sheets. The city outside roared with commerce and conversation, yet here, inside the walls, time slowed to the rhythm of a pulse barely noticed. He saw the nurses, exhausted, moving silently among the beds, their steps careful so as not to disturb what little peace remained. The patients stirred at times, whispering to one another, or tapping at the windows to remember the world beyond. Letters arrived from families, written in formal script and folded with care. They praised the doctors for their diligence, the nurses for their devotion, yet they never visited. One mother wrote, "We prayed daily for her recovery," and enclosed a coin. The daughter, sick and pale, would never touch it. The city's love was transactional, its empathy abstract. Hales recorded it all in his ledger. The empire has preserved its own reputation at the cost of humanity. Streets are clean, the sick are hidden. Fear has become both shield and sword. London forgets the very lives it claims to protect. In the evenings, he would walk along the river, listening to the water ripple past wharves, docks, and warehouses. The reflection of gas lamps in the black surface seemed like 1,000 small eyes, observing but unfeeling. Somewhere, beyond the fog, the city murmured. Children playing, markets closing, steps hurrying through wet streets. And yet, it did not notice those who had been sequestered, who existed in plain sight, but outside memory. When Hales returned to the wards, he often stood by the windows, watching shadows move across the courtyard. He imagined the city as it would look if it remembered, if the poor, the sick, the nameless, were seen not as threats but as citizens. But that was a fantasy. London had chosen to forget, and in forgetting, it had grown sterile, orderly, and unfeeling. And so, each night, within the walls of the hospital, the hidden lives of the sick continued quietly. The city went on, indifferent and bright, leaving the afflicted to breathe in its shadow, to live unseen, and to endure in the silence of a metropolis that had forgotten them. The chapel was tucked away in a narrow alley of Spitalfields, hidden behind buildings that leaned inward, as though to shelter it from the city's relentless eyes. Its sign, a simple wooden plank painted long ago, read, "Mission of St. Lazarus." Most Londoners passed without noticing, unaware that behind the unremarkable door lay a world removed from streets crowded with gaslight and commerce. Here, the sick, the forgotten, and the feared were allowed to breathe, to eat, and, occasionally, to touch without judgment. Sister Agnes had returned from an absence no one could quite place. Some said she had been to Ireland, others to India, seeking guidance from the nuns who had endured far worse. When she arrived at St. Lazarus, she brought with her a quiet authority, a calm that settled over the patients like warm cloth. She did not speak loudly or demand obedience. She moved through the chapel and the small wards, tending to the afflicted with hands steady and sure. Her eyes, grey and deep, seemed to see through walls, through curtains, through the masks that fear had taught the patients to wear. The mission had been established for decades, originally to shelter those with the disease in small cottages outside the city limits. Over time, it had grown into a warren of rooms and narrow passageways, a small community of souls whose illness made them both vulnerable and resilient. They gathered each day in the chapel, where prayers rose soft as the fog outside. The sisters taught them hymns, reading from pages worn thin, guiding their hands to the organ, to the prayer beads, to the simple act of folding linen with care. Dr. Hales visited the mission that morning, notes in hand, his coat damp with the fog from the Thames. He walked slowly down the aisles, observing, a man tracing patterns in the wood of a pew, a woman kneeling and touching a candle as if to feel its warmth, children sitting quietly with heads bowed, learning not only prayers, but the rhythm of a life that had been denied them elsewhere. He noticed the discipline not of force, but of routine that allowed the patients to exist within these walls as more than shadows. One patient, a seamstress from Mile End, lifted her hand to Hales. It was pale, scarred, and numb. Yet, under Sister Agnes's guidance, she held a piece of ribbon, sewing stitches slowly and deliberately. The act was simple, yet it carried dignity. Hales could see that the small, ordered motions gave the women and men control over a world that had otherwise demanded their silence and isolation. By evening, the rain had begun to fall over the city once more. Hales stood outside the mission, looking up at the windows glowing faintly through the mist. Inside, prayers were still being whispered, a soft counterpoint to the storm. The patients had formed a circle near the altar, holding hands, some with gloves, some bare, and they hummed quietly, a low, persistent sound that seemed to hold back the darkness outside. He wrote in his ledger later that night, "Here, the afflicted are not merely observed, they are remembered. Mercy is measured not by containment, but by attention, by touch, by ritual. The mission is a small island of humanity in a city that prefers to forget." As Hales walked back to his rooms, the sound of rain on the rooftops was interrupted by a faint hum of prayer carried through the fog. Somewhere, the city slept, oblivious. Somewhere within the walls of St. Lazarus, people remembered what it meant to be alive, and in that remembrance, they endured not simply as patients, but as witnesses to their own existence. The door to the autopsy room creaked on its hinges, a faint protest against the damp chill that had settled in the hospital's basement. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of carbolic, wet linen, and the faint metallic tang of preparation. Antiseptic mingled with decay in a way that made even the experienced surgeon pause. It was here, in this room with white-tiled walls and cold iron tables, that the body became both a subject and a confession, a vessel through which science might speak. Dr. Hales stood at the table, sleeves rolled high, gloves in place. Before him lay a patient recently transferred from the Chatham leper colony. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and the fingers curled inward like fragile roots. He had seen this before, countless times, but each body carried its own story, its own subtle defiance. Even in death, there was a whisper of life, a record of existence too often ignored by the city above. The nurses hovered at the door, eyes lowered, hands folded. They had learned the rhythm of the autopsy, the initial incision, the careful separation of tissue, the cataloguing of organs, and the preservation of what remained in alcohol. Each step required both precision and restraint, each gesture a negotiation with the silence of the departed. Hales began methodically, noting the changes that leprosy wrought on flesh. The extremities were most affected, fingers, toes, ears, yet deeper organs remained mostly untouched. There was a strange dichotomy here. A body partially surrendered to the disease while other parts clung stubbornly to life. He recorded every observation: lesions, nodules, thickened nerves, the faint pallor beneath the nails. Each note in his ledger felt like a conversation with the absent, a dialogue with those who could no longer respond. He paused at the hands, placing them side by side. They were small, delicate, and yet scarred, a testament to years of coping with numbness and stigma. He remembered the patients he had seen alive, the seamstresses, the sailor from Norway, the children tracing invisible patterns on glass. Each hand had carried memory and touch. Now, even in death, they spoke. As he worked, Hales considered the moral weight of the act. The Board of Health required documentation. The Empire demanded evidence. Yet, in this small room, removed from the city above, there was no audience except the walls, the tiled floor, and the faint echo of dripping water. Science and conscience intersected here, sometimes in harmony, often in tension. When the autopsy was complete, the body was prepared for storage. Samples were preserved in jars, catalogued with precise labels, and arranged in the basement archives. Hales lingered over one final observation, writing slowly, "The disease is present, but so is memory." The body records what the city ignores: hands that no longer feel, eyes that watch unseen, voices silenced by fear, all persist in their own way. He left the room, turning, the key in the lock, with deliberate care. The corridor beyond was quiet, the lamps flickering in the evening mist. Outside, London moved with its usual disregard, oblivious to the lives quarantined, catalogued, or erased. Yet in the basement, within the cold embrace of tile and carbolic, the bodies remained testimony to suffering, endurance, and the persistence of existence long after the city had forgotten them. For Hales, the lesson was clear. Disease could be studied, controlled, even contained, but memory, touch, and dignity were far more elusive and far more contagious than any pathogen the Empire could ever measure. Weeks passed after the initial headlines. The city had murmured, shivered, and whispered in hushed tones about the return of leprosy, and London had begun to move again as if the crisis were over. The newspapers, which had once screamed the disease's arrival in bold letters, now printed a different story, a retraction, couched in measured phrases, designed to reassure rather than alarm. Reports of widespread leprosy in London exaggerated. Authorities confirm containment. One headline read. Beneath it, a small paragraph noted the cases were isolated, monitored, and no longer considered a threat to the city at large. Dr. Hales held the paper in his hands, reading the words twice. The retraction was polite, factual, and cold, erasing the panic with ink and authority. Yet he could not forget the faces of the patients he had seen, the children tracing patterns on fogged windows, the seamstresses sewing silently in Soho, the sailor from Norway who had walked into the mist of the river. They were gone from the headlines, as if they had never existed at all. The newspaper had replaced them with reassurance. It spoke of order restored, of efficiency, of science triumphing over rumor. Hales had no quarrel with accuracy, but he understood how easy it was to turn people into statistics. the living reduced to numbers on a ledger, lives distilled into footnotes. The city would breathe easier now, blind to the quiet suffering that continued beyond walls, gates, and glass. By midday, the news had reached the cafes and markets. Shopkeepers read aloud the retraction, while customers pored over their purchases. The panic that had gripped Whitechapel dissipated like smoke, replaced by the hum of daily life coins clinking, carriages rattling, children calling to one another across the street. And yet, for Hales, the calm felt uneasy, artificial. The city's memory had been reset, but the disease, the isolation, the suffering, all of it remained. It had not disappeared. It had only been hidden. That evening, he walked along the riverbank, past the wharves where ships rested like darkened hulks in the fog. The water moved silently, carrying whispers from docks, alleys, and distant colonies. Hales thought of the leper colony at Chatham, the patients in street, Lazarus Mission, the girls by the window, and the hands pressed against panes in Mile End. All of them had been written out of the public record, reduced to obscurity by reassurance and retraction. In his office, he recorded his observations. The public is pacified, but not informed. The city comforts itself with the illusion of safety. Lives have been erased from the narrative. The disease persists. The fear persists, but neither is visible to the empire anymore. Later, he found himself looking through the archive of past newspapers, tracing the shift in language from alarm to measured caution, from urgency to calm, from human story to sterile record. Each correction, each retraction, was another layer of forgetfulness, a shield for the city's conscience. He lit a candle, letting its soft glow illuminate the page. Beyond the window, the fog pressed against the glass, and the distant bells of a parish echoed faintly. Somewhere in the city, a mother pulled her child close, and somewhere else, a patient traced the outline of a window frame with fingers that could no longer feel. The city had forgotten them, officially and thoroughly. But Dr. Hales knew better. He wrote the final note in his ledger that night. The empire corrects its record. The living remain invisible. And memory, unlike the printed word, refuses to be retracted. She was alone in a corner room on the upper floor. The walls pale and bare, except for the crucifix above the bed. The window faced east, catching the first weak light of dawn that sifted through London's persistent fog. No one remembered her name. She had been admitted as an adult, long after most of the early cases had been documented. By the time Hales walked the ward that morning, she had been lying quietly for weeks, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of her chest. The nurses whispered about her, speaking in half voices, careful not to disturb the stillness that had claimed her. "The last one," they said. "She will go quietly." They moved silently around the bed, checking the linens, adjusting the pillows, offering water that she did not drink. Even the matron, usually brisk and efficient, lingered for a moment, her hands folded, her eyes tracing the curve of the patient's fingers. They were pale, almost translucent, curled inward as though pressed by memory itself. Hales approached slowly, notebook in hand. He had watched this disease for years, documented its spread, its patterns, the numbness that claimed fingers and toes first, the patches of skin that hardened, the gradual withdrawal from the world. But something about this woman struck him differently, not the disease itself, but the utter quiet with which she had accepted its dominion. She lay as if she had already left the world, and yet, in a small, faint way, she still remained. He spoke her name gently, though he did not know it. "Are you comfortable?" No answer came, only the faint tremor of her chest beneath the thin blanket. He placed his hand near hers, careful not to touch, and felt the air stir with the rhythm of life, minimal, persistent, stubborn. Hales wondered how long she had waited, how many days she had counted, how many nights she had pressed her mind against the ceiling, imagining the streets outside, the fog curling along the river, the bells tolling somewhere beyond memory. Hours passed, The ward remained silent. Hales walked from bed to bed, checking vitals, adjusting charts, observing the few remaining patients who had survived the earlier waves. He returned to the last patient just before dusk, noting the color of the light as it faded through the window. The pale orange hue touched her cheeks faintly, as though the sun itself remembered her existence for a single instant. By midnight, the nurses found her still alive but barely. Her pulse had slowed to a whisper. Her breathing was measured, faint, deliberate. Hales sat beside the bed, recording the time, the notes, the observation. He thought of the thousands who had passed through the wards before her, the faces that had become statistics, the hands that had pressed invisible patterns on glass. She was the last, and in her silence, she held the story of all the rest. When she finally passed in the early hours, the room smelled faintly of carbolic, damp linen, and the faint sweetness of waxed floors. The nurses prepared her body with care, folding her hands, adjusting the blanket, leaving the window open for the morning light. Hales made the final entry in his ledger. Patient 152 deceased. The last of the documented cases. Life persisted until its quietest conclusion. He lingered by the window long after the body was removed, staring into the grey dawn. The city outside moved on, oblivious, unaware that a chapter had closed, and that the last witness to the Empire's fear, its neglect, and its hidden mercy had now gone. But within the walls of the asylum, the memory of her existence would linger, a faint echo, a pulse of light in the shadow, a reminder that even in isolation, humanity had endured. The museum stood at the edge of the city, a quiet building of brick and stone whose windows were tall and colored with streaks of deep blue, amber, and crimson. Inside, the air smelled of varnish and dust, mingled with the faint metallic tang of glass and the faint acidity of years spent preserving artifacts. It was here, in this repository of memory and craft, that Dr. Hales had arranged to store some of the items recovered from the wards, samples, sketches, and a few personal effects that had survived the burnings and fumigations of the hospital. He walked through the high-ceilinged gallery, where sunlight fell in fractured patterns through the stained glass windows. The colors splintered against the polished floors, casting fragments of amber and red across the display cases. Inside each, the preserved hands, gloves, and small trinkets of the afflicted lay in quiet rows. The labels were precise. Subject 17, hand, female, mile end, specimen 34 fingertip, male, Rotherhithe, glove ivory, silk, anonymous. Visitors wandered slowly through the aisles, unaware that some of these objects had once been alive, had once pressed against skin, had once been vessels of memory. The curator explained them as relics of medical history, scientific curiosities. Few noticed the slight tremor in Hales's hand as he adjusted a glass case, aligning a set of preserved fingers with the light. He saw not only what they were, but who they had been: the seamstress who never left her shop, the sailor who walked into the river mist, the child who remembered touch. A group of schoolchildren passed through, whispering and pointing. One girl bent close to a display, pressing her nose against the glass. Hales saw in her reflection the same curiosity he had once felt as a boy reading medical treatises in his father's library. She leaned back, looking at him, her eyes wide, and he realized that the objects inside the cases were not merely evidence of disease, but of lives lived, of isolation endured, of humanity stubbornly preserved. He paused beside a glove, ivory and folded carefully, its silk threads still delicate despite the years. It had belonged to a woman from Soho, a seamstress who had worn it to hide numbness, to protect herself from fear and suspicion. He traced the outline with a gloved fingertip, feeling, in a strange way, the weight of her presence. Hales moved on, stopping at a small wooden box containing scraps of paper letters, notes, tiny sketches by patients who had long since passed. He opened it carefully, reading lines written in faded ink. I felt it again, the color of pain. The roses will bloom. I am still alive, even if no one else can see. Each line was a thread connecting the living to the silent dead, to a world London had forgotten. By the time he left the museum, the sun had dipped behind the chimneys, and the last of the light had gone from the stained glass. The corridors were empty, the displays still, yet he could feel the presence of those who had touched them, whose lives had left traces in the delicate fibers of silk, the faint fingerprints pressed into wax, the ink of letters too fragile to read without care. Outside, the fog crept back from the river, swallowing the streets in grey. Hales walked home slowly, thinking that memory, unlike disease, could not be quarantined. The city might forget the living, hide the afflicted, and rewrite its own stories. But in the quiet rooms of the museum, in the coloured shards of glass and preserved remnants, the forgotten persisted, stubborn, luminous, eternal. She was small, lively, and curious in the way children tend to be, before the world begins to weigh them down with rules and fear. Dr. Hales's granddaughter, Clara, had grown accustomed to the quiet hours spent in the hospital archives, the smell of carbolic lingering on his coat, the faint hum of the wards echoing through the walls. Her father had died before she was born, and the stories she heard of her grandfather's work were filtered through the prism of memory, filtered and softened, as if to make the horror bearable. Clara wandered the aisles of the archive one morning, sunlight falling through the tall windows and scattering across the wooden floors. Jars lined the shelves, each containing a fragment of a life, a hand, a glove, a piece of parchment with a sketch. The labels were precise, clinical, and indifferent. Subject 17, female, Mile End. Specimen 34, male, Rotherhithe. To any visitor, the objects were mere curiosities, remnants of a city's past struggles with disease. To Clara, they were far more than that. They were people. She picked up a small glove, ivory silk, frayed at the seams, and held it in her hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she imagined the life it had once protected, a seamstress working through summer heat, keeping her hands covered to hide the numbness that had slowly claimed them. The thought made her shiver. She placed it back carefully, as though returning a small piece of soul to its resting place. Her grandfather followed her quietly, observing from the shadows. "Do you know who these people were?" he asked. His voice was soft, filled with a weight that only decades of witnessing suffering could carry. Clara shook her head. "I know they were someone," she said, her eyes lingering on a small sketch of a child tracing invisible patterns on glass. "But I don't know them." Hales sighed and knelt beside her. They were the last witnesses of a world the city chose to forget. They carried disease, yes, but more than that, they carried memory, touch, and dignity in a time when neither was safe. He showed her letters, folded and faded, where patients had written of daily life, the smell of rain, the warmth of sunlight on skin that could no longer feel it, the quiet resilience of a mind tethered to memory. Clara read aloud the words of a seamstress. "The roses will bloom even if no one waters them." "Do you see, Clara?" Hales said. "Even in isolation, they preserved themselves. They found ways to endure, to exist fully, in a world that preferred they vanish." Clara traced the sketches with her fingertips, imagining hands that could no longer touch, feet that no longer felt, eyes that had witnessed without being seen. She understood, in that quiet moment, that the city had forgotten these people, but they had not forgotten themselves. Later, as they left the archives, the fog rolled over the cobblestones outside, muffling the sound of distant bells. Clara glanced back at the windows of the museum, imagining the preserved lives within. Her grandfather placed a hand on her shoulder. "One day you may tell their stories," he said. She nodded. The city around them moved on, indifferent, busy, and unaware. But somewhere inside her, she carried the memory of every forgotten hand, every silent prayer, every face preserved in glass and ink, and she understood that remembrance was a quiet rebellion, one that no city could erase. The city slept, though it never truly rested. Gas lamps flickered along streets slick with rain, and the Thames moved silently beneath the bridges, black and reflective, carrying the city's secrets downstream. Above the bustle, above the clatter of carriages and the whispers of those who had survived, London seemed at peace, orderly, disciplined, unaware of the lives it had quarantined and catalogued in shadows. Yet beneath the cobblestones, beneath the walls of hospitals and mission chapels, beneath the polished facades and the clamour of commerce, the city pulsed differently. Dr. Hales walked alone along the embankment, the fog curling around his coat like a living thing. He thought of every patient he had seen, every hand pressed to glass, every finger lost to numbness, every child tracing patterns in the mist. The empire had claimed to protect itself, to quarantine disease, to preserve civility, but in doing so, it had forgotten something far more enduring: the quiet persistence of life, the stubborn memory of those it sought to erase. He passed warehouses and docks, the buildings casting long shadows that merged with the fog. Somewhere, a horse whinnied. Somewhere, a child laughed quietly, unaware that history had already marked them. Hales knew the city beneath the skin, not the streets and bridges, the markets and offices, but the hidden life, the silent endurance, the pulse that continued even when unacknowledged. Each patient he had touched, each story he had recorded, left an imprint not just on his mind, but on the collective memory of the city itself. Inside the wards, the air remained thick with antiseptic and the faint odor of wax and damp linen. The beds were empty now, the last patient gone, yet the walls seemed to hum with the echoes of those who had lived there. He imagined the seamstress in Soho, the sailor from Norway, the girl at the window. Their hands had left impressions on the air, on the floors, on the world that had tried to forget them. He thought of the letters and sketches preserved in the archives, the jars of skin and specimens in the museum. The stories carried quietly from one generation to the next. London had erased faces, rewritten records, and claimed victory over fear and disease. But the city beneath the skin, the living memory, the quiet defiance, the dignity of those it had hidden remained. It was in the touch of a glove, the faint mark of a hand, the rhythm of prayer in a forgotten chapel. It was in the persistence of those who had learned to endure, to exist fully, even when the world told them not to. Hales stopped at a bridge, looking down at the water. The current was slow and relentless, carrying the fog and the city's sighs toward the estuary. Somewhere upstream, unseen, children pressed their hands to windows, mothers whispered protective prayers, and the faint echo of bells drifted through the mist. The empire believed it had controlled the disease, the public panic, the memory of the afflicted. But control was an illusion. Beneath the surface, beneath the polished stone and soot-darkened brick, the city remembered. He wrote his final note in the ledger that night. The empire may erase names, close doors, and publish reassurances, but the lives that endured, the touch remembered, and the dignity preserved, these remain in the city beneath the skin. Fear can be legislated, disease contained, yet memory and humanity persist beyond both. As he left the hospital and walked home, the fog swirled around him, the river whispered beneath the bridges, and London slept, but the city, beneath its skin, pulsed quietly, insistently, and alive.